If you can take your seats, please. Good afternoon. My name is Karl Arnault. I'm particularly happy we can have this half-day seminar today about the EU-Japan Economic Partnership, which is an extremely important agreement which everybody knows was concluded sometime by the end of last year, was approved by the European Parliament, and has gone through fairly rapidly against many expectations if you see what happened with some other trade agreements before here. But it's extremely important that we can have, certainly in the current context of what we read in the newspapers about trade restrictions, barriers, tariffs, amongst other countries, we can have a discussion about one of the biggest, if not the biggest trade agreement ever concluded in history between the EU and Japan, which together represent something like 30% of GDP, but probably half of world trade. It's also important to have this debate now, not only because of the international context, also because Japan has the presidency of the G20, and later this month we have an important G20 meeting in Osaka, where these and other things will be discussed. So the trade issue will certainly be on the agenda. They're very high on the minds of many policymakers and large business, and they're creating lots of problems and a lot of stress and nervousness in the markets. But we also know there are some big outstanding issues in the international trading system. Of course, there is the position of China, which is provoking problems. But there is also, institutional issues like the nomination of members of the appellate body, which if by the end of this year we don't have a nomination, we will not have a dispute settlement in the context of the WTO, which is something unheard of and something I personally cannot imagine that something like that can happen. So it's in this context, as I said, I'm very happy we can have this seminar, and we have, I think, an interesting program during about 3 hours. We have 2 keynote speeches by the Sherpa from the EU and by the ambassador of Japan to the EU. And then we have 2 panels on the partnership agreement, one, and then a second one on the WTO dimension. So the 2 dimensions which I sketched out in the beginning, we're focusing as well on the partnership agreement, as well as on the relationship of this partnership agreement with the broader multilateral trading agenda, because that's what Japan and the EU, that will be their address or their mandate, which they will try to have towards the G20 in Osaka, preserving the international trading system. On some practical issues, this meeting is on the record. It's live streamed as well. So there will maybe people watching from outside, but there will be no questions from those from outside. But we hope, let's say, that we'll have a good debate with those inside. We'll have first, as I said, the 2 keynote speeches, and after that we have 2 panels. There is on the program no coffee break foreseen, but we could have a coffee break between, say, if we end a bit earlier or a bit later, between 15:25, say 3:30, and then start a bit later. But it's very important to say that for these 2 panels, we have a good Q&A, so please prepare for that. We would like to have many insights also from you in this very important issue. We'll have a summary which will be made afterwards by our 2 of our colleagues. There's Wainian, who's been organizing this seminar together with my other colleague Guillaume. I don't see him here for the moment. Both are, both are trade experts. Both have done a PhD in law and trade issues and trade agreements. So that will certainly be helpful to further advance the debate, which is our intention. So as a keynote speech, I should probably begin with the ambassador rather than with Antoine Cassel. I will follow the order of things. Ambassador, you wanted to start, if I give you the floor first, because you, I would say we are so happy that we can host you and that we can welcome you here. And also we know that you have an extensive experience on trade matters, and we look forward to your speech. Ambassador.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, let me recognize, of course, Mr. Karel Lanu, the CEO of SEPS. Thank you for organizing this very, I think, pertinent, the platform where we can discuss all these important issues. Of course, Mr. Antoine Cassel, very distinguished EU Sherpa for the G20, also cabinet of the President of the European Commission, distinguished panelists, speakers, guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start with, of course, thank you all for, of course, very much for today's invitation. I am delighted to have an opportunity to deliver some views at this meeting, at this interesting and important seminar titled, I quote, EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement and Reforming the Multilateral Trading System, unquote. Now, in the year when our Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA, now I say EPA instead of Economic Partnership Agreement, creating the world's biggest open and fair economic space or zone has entered into force, and during which Japan has assumed so-called the G20 presidency for the first time, the chair of the G20 meeting, hosting the G20 summit in Osaka on this month, June the 28th and 29th, where trade issues will be one of the major priorities, no doubt about it. I cannot imagine any other themes which could be more interesting and appropriate to discuss with our European partners than today's topic. Today, I would firstly like to highlight how important the Japan EPA is, not only for strengthening economic ties between Japan and Europe, but also for further enhancing our bilateral cooperation at a truly global level. Then I will move on to Japan's expectations for a successful G20 Osaka summit and take stock of the ongoing discussions pertaining to the issue of WTO reform. Close cooperation and coordination between Japan as the chair and the EU is one of the most important keys to achieving both of these goals. Now, our EPA, which entered into force on the 1st of February this year, has already delivered a tangible impact in our bilateral economic relations. According to statistics published by the Japanese Customs Authority, during February and March this year, the import of cheese, wine, and pork meat from the European Union significantly increased by 14%, 32%, and 10% respectively in comparison with the same period last year. A senior official from Tokyo who recently visited Brussels told me, I quote, "Ambassador, cheese and wine used to be my standard souvenirs when I made business trips to Europe. But Ambassador, this time my wife told me, you don't have to buy cheese or wine for me anymore. Just choose your other things which are difficult to find in Japan. After the EPA, everyone can easily find high quality and reasonably priced European cheese and wine throughout Japan," unquote. So now, the EPA also means, of course, a win-win, two-way market liberalization for the EU and Japan. Now, in this respect, another good news story is that there was an increase of auto exports from Japan to the EU in February and March of this year by 14.3% in comparison to the same period last year. Let me talk a little bit more about the broader significance of the EPA. The Japan-EU EPA is one of, Japan's biggest achievements in its key trade policy, along with the CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, better known as TPP-11, minus United States, of course. TPP-11 entered into force on the 30th December last year to create an important free trade zone in the Asia-Pacific region, which covers about 500 million people and 13% of the world's GDP. So, however, our EPA, the Japan EPA, creates the world's biggest free, open, and fair economic space, which comprises almost 640 million people, covers about 30% of the world GDP and nearly 40% of global trade. So given its unprecedented scale, the impact and significance of this EPA is obvious, not only for our bilateral trade relations, but also for the entire global trading system. Furthermore, I would like to point out the fact that our EPA is named, and yes, Economic Partnership Agreement sounds like a tautology, but not an FTA. FTA means, of course, free trade agreement. Why? Why, you may ask? Because it goes far beyond ordinary FTAs. On this point, I could not have agreed more with President Juncker when he spoke as it came into force, and in his words, fully identified the nature of our EPA. So I quote, "Our agreement shows that trade is about more than quotas and tariffs, or millions and billions. It is about values, principles, and fairness. It makes sure that our principles in areas such as labor, safety, climate, and consumer protection are the global gold standard. This only happens when you work with the most natural of partners, separated by thousands of kilometers, but united in friendship and values," unquote. I really like this quote. Now, Japan and the EU strongly support multilateralism, of course, free trade, and above all, a rules-based world order. We are important partners that share common values such as human rights, democracy, the rule of law. In today's world, where our common values are confronted by, I say, various challenges such as unilateralism and protectionism, fueled by populism and nationalism, all over the world, the strategic importance of our Japan-EU cooperation has never been more vital. With the entry into force of the EPA, Japan and the EU are sending a powerful message to promote free, fair, and rules-based trade and to discourage protectionism. The EPA demonstrates the firm political will of Japan and the EU to the rest of the world to keep the flag of free trade waving high. This is a little bit a poetic expression anyway, and to powerfully advance free trade. Now, let me turn to Japan's priorities in the forthcoming G20 Osaka summit. This year, Japan has assumed the EU G20 presidency for the first time and will host G20 Osaka summit 3 weeks from now. Now, G20 as the premier forum for international economic cooperation brings together top leaders of developed and emerging economies with a growing presence in the international economy. Of course, the EU is one of its major players. As downturn risks appear to be on the rise, and as trade tensions have started to have a negative impact on the real economy, it is all the more incumbent upon G20 leaders to address the risks and challenges of the global economy and be ready to respond effectively. So against this backdrop, Prime Minister Abe intends to chair the G20 Osaka summit in accordance with the following 3 agenda items. Still, this is a tentative, but anyway, I try to share this with you. The first is the most important issue facing us right now, namely, working to maintain and ultimately strengthen the free and fair order for international trade. The second is regarding the digital economy. While digitalization of the economy has made unique and unprecedented business models possible, we are at the same time also facing new challenges such as double taxation for multinational companies. We are called upon to search out ways of resolving such issues one after the other on the basis of international cooperation. Here, Prime Minister advocates for the building of a, I quote, data free flow with trust, unquote, so-called DFFT system. This is an approach that attempts to allow the free flow of data according to rules we can all count upon. He will call on G20 leaders to prepare rules so that the benefits of the digital economy spread to everyone, and needless to say that the advantages come to all people the world over. This is one of the, I think I would say, the elements of inclusiveness. The process for doing that is what we call the Osaka track, which we hope to launch at the Osaka G20 summit. Now let me then touch on the G20 and WTO reform. It goes without saying that points 1 and 2, which I mentioned above, are entirely inseparable from reforms to the WTO. A quarter century has passed since the WTO came into being. During that time, the world economy has changed at amazing speed, including in terms of digitalization. The WTO, however, has, I must say, failed to keep up with this. And the adverse effects of this are becoming increasingly apparent as time goes on. What should we do to make the WTO relevant again as a guardian of the free and fair global trading system? This is the question which you have to address. The Prime Minister strongly hopes to blow a new breeze into the WTO at this juncture through the Osaka track. Although the G20 is not a negotiating forum, no, but G20 can and should provide strong political impetus for a better functioning WTO, attuned to rapidly changing global trading environments such as explosive growth in e-commerce. So in the context of data governance, negotiations in the WTO on e-commerce will be at the center of the discussions. In Osaka, it is expected that strong momentum will be created for the negotiations on electronic commerce within the framework of the WTO. System reform needs to be underpinned by efforts to tackle persistent market distorting trading practices. Representing 80% of the global economy, G20 members have to assume special responsibility by keeping their markets open and refraining from such practices. Now, the third point is the importance of innovation. The Prime Minister intends to link the discussion on this power of innovation through developments such as IoT, Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence to addressing global challenges such as the SDGs, marine plastic litter, Africa, climate change, and quality infrastructure. Now, finally, let me say a few words on WTO reform and then EU-Japan, also Japan, EU-US Trilateral cooperation. In parallel with the G20 process, Japan and the EU, together with the United States, are intensively discussing WTO reform through a series of trilateral meetings of trade ministers, in which Ambassador Lighthizer, United States US Trade Representative, Ms. Malmstrom, European Commissioner for Trade, and Mr. Seko, Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan, participate. The very first trilateral meeting was held in Buenos Aires on December the 13th, 2017, so nearly 2 years ago. You may be surprised, oh, is that true? The trilateral meetings are going on, even under President Trump? It is going on. The sixth and latest ministerial meeting was held recently on May the 23rd in Paris on the sidelines of the OECD ministerial meeting. And here, ministers took stock of the progress of the discussions. As the joint statement, I very much recommend you to have a look at the joint statement of the 6th meeting, 5th, 4th, 3rd. Lots of food, plenty of food for thought on WTO reform. Anyway, this statement said, we can observe considerable outcomes in a variety of issues, including non-market policies and practices, market oriented conditions, forced technology transfer policies and practices, industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises, WTO reform, and digital trade and e-commerce. Quite comprehensive. As the presidency of the G20, it is encouraging to see the three like-minded players having very concrete discussions to achieve WTO reform on the steel excess capacity issue. The ministers even expressed their expectations for further cooperation during the G20 ministerial meeting on trade and digital economy to be held on 8th and 9th of this month, actually this weekend, at Tsukuba in Japan. Now, Prime Minister Abe, in his Davos speech this January, declaring his determination to ensure the success of Japan's G20 presidency, cited the Japan-EU EPA and the importance of ever closer cooperation between Japan and the EU. And this message has been reaffirmed by our leaders, Prime Minister Abe, Mr. Juncker, and Mr. Tusk of the EU side, in their joint statement adopted at the 26th Japan-EU Summit on the 25th of April this year, which says, I quote, "We welcome the entry into force of the EPA as one of the greatest achievements in Japan-EU relations. The EPA is the model of high standard rules in the 21st century to promote free, open, rules-based and fair trading investment," unquote. And our leaders also reiterated their commitment to, I quote, "keeping markets open and to strengthening the rules-based international trading, multilateral trading system with WTO as its core. We confirm our intention to continue working to advance WTO reform. Japan and the EU will work together to improve the current WTO rules to address global trade challenges. We also agreed on continuously working to enhance the monitoring function in WTO regular committees and to cooperate in order to also ensure the proper functioning of the appellate body. Indeed, this is Mr. Lanu earlier touched on. So, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude my remarks, let me say trade is back right at the center stage to the leaders' agenda. The world has never needed closer cooperation between Japan and the EU more than today. We have gained a robust legal basis for that. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for this opening word. Very timely, very interesting. And again, we just do not realize how important that agreement is. And I think even a few years ago, it was seen to be almost impossible to conclude such an agreement. But it was concluded, and it is a very large and a very important agreement. I pass the floor to Antoine Marcel from the cabinet of Commission President Juncker, who's also the G20 Sherpa and who's fully involved into these matters. Antoine, thank you for joining us and for completing this opening speech.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. I see some familiar faces in the audience. It's always a pleasure to be here. And so my name, as it was indicated, is Antoine Cazelle. I'm the G20 Sherpa for the EU, representing both President Juncker and President Tusk. The system is like this in the EU. And I would like to thank, of course, SEPS and the Japanese mission and all the speakers for this extremely interesting seminar with two important panels. And I especially thank the ambassador for the very nice and kind words that he has addressed as the introduction of this seminar. These discussions are particularly relevant and timely in view of the G20 Leaders Summit that will take place in Osaka at the end of the month, and the ministerial meetings that are ongoing and taking place almost as we speak to prepare this important summit. And I would like to use this occasion to underline also our excellent cooperation with the Japanese G20 presidency as an example of our also excellent bilateral relations based on, as you have indicated, common values, which is effectively the very core word between our two big assembled regions. And so let me now inform you a little bit about our priorities and the key messages that we would like to address in view of this important summit. And I will start with a very important concept, which is multilateralism. And as the leaders reaffirmed last year in December in Buenos Aires, the G20 members should work together to improve the rules-based international order to ensure that it is capable of effectively responding to a rapidly changing world. There is no better alternative than coordinated multilateral cooperation, which should aim at security and prosperity of our people, ensuring a fair, level playing field among all nations in order to shape a globalized, interconnected world in line with our shared interest and, again, our values. And so in Osaka, we will work very closely with the Japanese presidency to keep the G20 as an efficient, relevant, and credible forum which delivers on its word and on tackling new challenges. However, we can anticipate that this will require strong collective efforts. And if we look at today's global economy, it is, let's be clear, in a delicate stage. The risk of the global economy are accumulating and growth is slowing down. On the other hand, there are also bright aspects to the global economy, including the continued monetary policy accommodation both by the Fed and the European Central Bank. So there is a broad agreement among G20 members that leaders in Osaka need to convey a positive message to global markets on the ability of the G20 to cooperate in order to support confidence. And if we talk about cooperation, the key uncertainty for the global economy at the moment continues to be the ongoing trade tensions. And any sustainable solution will need to be rules-based and non-discriminatory and address the root causes of these tensions. So let's recall that already in Hamburg, our leaders, the G20 leaders, committed to level the level playing field for trade and investment, fighting protectionism, including all unfair trade practices. As most Sherpas pointed out, it will be extremely important that the upcoming G20 Trade Ministerial meeting that will take place in Tsukuba and the Osaka Summit contribute to operationalize the support that all our leaders provided last year in Buenos Aires to the reform of the World Trade Organization. And in our view, beyond taking stock of the ongoing efforts in Geneva, the Osaka Summit should also provide steer to this process with very clear messages. And the first one is recognizing that a balanced reform should cover the three functions of the WTO: the monitoring function, the negotiating function, and of course, the dispute settlement system. Referring to some concrete aspects of the necessary reform, such as the work on transparency, e-commerce, subsidies, and what many G20 members have mentioned as critical, the urgent reinforcement of the settlement function to ensure that the system remains efficient and also operational. To address the root causes of these trade tensions, we also hope that trade ministers will already agree on the need to continue the work on an important forum, the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity, in its current form to deliver on previous commitments. Another important topic for the Osaka Summit, and of course a key priority for the EU, will be the opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to the full and effective implementation of the Paris Agreement, sending a strong message ahead of the United Nations Climate Summit that will take place in New York in September, and the climate conference which will take place in Chile in December. This is, of course, an important track for which we will have to clearly show that we are fully behind this Paris Agreement, and of course the EU will be extremely keen in taking this forward. Now, turning to the finance aspects and the finance track, as we call it in the G20 world, the work of the G20 finance ministers in the OECD Inclusive Forum to get a consensual global solution on the taxation of the digital economy will need all our energy, including the momentum provided by leaders at the summit. And we very much hope that we can agree on a roadmap for work leading into a consensus-based outcome in 2020. As you know, the OECD is preparing a report that the ministers of finance and economy will look at in the next meeting, and we very much hope that this will be able to, for us at the G20 summit, to endorse the roadmap that will be able to provide a solution to this very important issue. Equally, we are also very supporting that the high-level principles on quality infrastructure help crowd in environmentally, economically, and socially responsible private finance for much-needed infrastructure, which is as important for advanced economy than for emerging market economies. And I understand that the work is also very much going into the right direction among the relevant working groups, so that we have these principles referred to in our communiqué in June. Now let me turn to other important topics and of course of importance for the EU. Demographic change and aging workforce are common challenges to many G20 countries, and we very much support the efforts of the Japanese presidency to find common solutions on these very important topics. And this is also linked to the collective efforts to deliver on the G20 Brisbane commitments taken some years ago to increase women labor market participation. We are confident that in Osaka we will achieve further progress on women empowerment, including on this matter, and we very much hope that this women empowerment issue and women inclusion issue will continue to be addressed by the next presidencies. It will be very much important to have regular monitoring and reporting on how this is being addressed and reducing this gap and this gender gap that was agreed in Brisbane. Under Prime Minister Abes' leadership, the Japanese presidency has also put a strong emphasis on the digitalization, as you have highlighted, of the global economy. And we are working on here 4 main priorities. The first is supporting the concept that Prime Minister Abe has introduced in the Davos Forum, which is on data free flow with trust. You have referred to it too. Which is an important concept that we will be having to work on at the summit, but also after the summit. The second one is creating an enabling environment for artificial intelligence. The third is, of course, digital security. And the fourth is digitalization for sustainable development goals and inclusions. This includes the issue of overcoming the digital divide, including by improving the user-friendliness in the aging society. This year will also be again important to underline our commitment to the full implementation of the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals, sending a strong message of support ahead of the high-level political forum that will take place in September in New York. And linked to that, we also would like to build on the Africa-Europe Alliance for Sustainable Investment and Jobs to reaffirm the EU support to the G20 partnerships with Africa that started under the German G20 presidency 2 years ago. For the EU, it will be important to support continued international cooperation also on migration and displacement, and we will very much, and we appreciate the efforts also of the Japanese presidency to keep that important topics, which has not only economic consequences, but also political, social, and environmental consequences. So very important topic to keep on the agenda of the G20. And finally, following recent attacks, we will reaffirm EU's efforts in the fight against terrorism, and in particular the spread of terrorist content online in full respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And there also we appreciate the efforts that has been ongoing by the presidency, but also by other key partners at the G20 in order to update the important Hamburg Declaration on Terrorism that the leaders have adopted, so that it is fully implemented and updated with the recent needs following the recent attacks. So let me conclude on this basis that I am confident that the G20 summit in Osaka will be a success, and we will be, of course, working hard with the Japanese presidency to contribute to that success. I very much believe into the G20 way of working. This will be, by the way, in principle, my last G20 summit as a Sherpa. It's been now 5 years that I'm following this important work, and I have to say that I always wonder what would be a world without the G20. Just let you imagine what it can be. So let's hope that we can actually work together, because as a famous rock band would say, together we win and divided we fall. So I thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Antoine. I mean, I hope, could there be time for a few questions? So if there is anyone from the audience, you can probably take a place here, Ambassador and Antoine. So who has a question he wants to raise to the Sherpa or to the Ambassador of Japan? I could certainly probably start. I mean, Ambassador Kodoma, I remember your Prime Minister has a special relationship with Trump, and I don't think there are so many Prime Ministers in the world which can be proud of the relationship that your Prime Minister has established. He was the first one, I remember, when I was in Japan almost 3 years ago, he was the first one to go and see him when he was just elected sometime in November. And he has continued to meet Ambassador Trump very often. Also only met him, I think, a few weeks ago again. So do you expect that as chairman of the G20, your Prime Minister could achieve something special with Trump?
Well, I have been, of course, as the representative of the Japanese government based here in Brussels for the last nearly 2.5 years. Of course, I have been following very closely how my Prime Minister actually has been engaging Mr. Trump in the United States at the same time. But my actually credo, my very fundamental actually, the position is that I think together with the US and the EU, I mean that as long as we continue to succeed in trilateral cooperation, coordination among the three, we'll be able to make a difference, I think, to better this global world, I think, confronting all kinds of challenges. Of course, we should not never forget about China, India, Brazil, emerging economies. But I think really, we, the trilaterals, are really based, our partnership are based on shared common values. So that is our starting point. And then, of course, so Prime Minister, indeed, has been, is really no doubt about it, I think, arguably, the #1 foreign leader who has spent the most hours with Mr. Trump, who has played golf on most occasions, I think, never before, but then also shared, well, also over dinners and the lunches, I think, talked a lot about. And I think through these, my view is, again, is through these really, I think, topmost, contacts over the last, I think, the 2.5 years, I think, Prime Minister Abe actually has somehow proved himself to maybe to his fellow leaders in Europe, EU, or wherever they are. I think we have to engage the leader of the world #1 superpower bar none. And then, of course, keep engaging with this president, I think, and then so there's no other way but to engage with this president. And then somehow, yes, we have been working very hard. And then, indeed, I think somehow, I think also Prime Minister actually, I think is very good at really, I think, nicely, I would say, engage the debate with Mr. Trump on a one-on-one basis, I think. So good at, I think, presenting a kind of facts. And after all, of course, I mean, we talk a lot about the fake news and, the untruthful statements, whatever. But I think Prime Minister stays very steadily on course to provide his counterpart a fact-based analysis, evidence-based analysis, and then also try to always to cultivate better personal relationship. Somehow these have been, I think, paying off very well. So sorry I talked too much, but in the end, I'm so confident President Trump will come to Osaka. And then also not only he will meet with Prime Minister Abe, I'm sure he will meet with Mr. Xi Jinping of China and Mr. Putin of Russia and beyond.
Thank you. Other question from the audience? Yes, there's a question there. You could stand up. I don't know whether there's a microphone, but you can stand up, and if you please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. My name is Kubrika Mela. I'm an economic advisor at the European Political Strategy Center at the European Commission. I'm very glad to hear that Japan, the US, and the EU are meeting regularly, 6 meetings, they're discussing. But I would be curious to hear what are the plans, how to engage with China further. I mean, we cannot think about reforming WTO excluding China. And at what point in time will we feel confident that actually, we are ready to engage with them? Or, if you can just give us a little bit of feedback, what's the process going forward? Because if we want to find, if we want to have a true reform of WTO, I mean, we cannot think about exploring that much as powerful advantage. Thank you.
Maybe my first answer to your question is, if you read, again, it's very carefully, the joint statements of the 6th Trilateral Ministers meeting, you'll find an answer to your question, really. But my point is, in those statements, never ever that China is mentioned. But the issues being discussed by the Trilateral Ministers, Mr. Lighthizer, Ms. Malmström, my trade minister, they are discussing on how to ensure, yes, level playing field involving China or any other big players, I think, in the world. Also us, of course, USChina. So yes, this is a challenge because after all, number two, US on its own taking its bilateral kind of measures, right on take on China, one-on-one basis. So of course we have to calibrate how then, but our view is such that I think through really, as I said before, reinvigorating the trilateral process, trilateral kind of platform, I think we can also send a good message to the United States. And then to also to further coordinate, I think I hope a joint position on all these issues of state subsidies, right? And then forced transfer of technologies, all these issues, indeed, all these issues, what you find in the joint statement of the 6th Trilateral meeting. Well, US, Mr. Lighthizer, has been really working very hard vis-a-vis China on their bilateral basis. So anyway, I think, yes, we have to, and also I'm sure the EU and US also has been undertaking their bilateral negotiation. We too. So anyway, but I'm so sure these, I think, yes, ongoing negotiations, I think EU is, I'm sure, is so much mindful of to ensure the multilateralism will not be damaged, impaired, or even let us strengthen it. I think that is the view of my government, that of course, EU, and I hope we just continue to involve the United States. That is our maybe tentative, what you call modus vivendi or modus operandi. Yeah, I think so. Maybe, yes.
Yeah, maybe let me compliment on that question. By the way, my two leaders also have a good relationship with Mr. Trump. There is mutual respect, as you know, and this has led to also some bilateral negotiations which are ongoing. I mean, on the Chinese issue, I honestly don't see how China will not engage into this important process in a positive way. China has, of course, some red lines. We have our red lines. The US have red lines. Others have red lines. But China has very much benefited from globalization, multilateralism, and is very much praising this as much as we in Japan, I think, praise multilateralism. And so this, at the end of the day, will prevail, I think, on this isolation that some are advocating. So I very much think that China, and we have been engaging with them indeed also on a bilateral basis. We had a recent, very important EU-China summit, and where we have issued, by the way, as the EU, an important communication on how we address China and how it is a strategic but still rival and competitor, but an important partner. And I think likewise, and I think there is mutual respect. And I always had very good relationship with my Chinese counterparts at my level, and they always, at the end of the day, engaged, and we always found a common solution. So I don't want to sound as too over-optimistic, but I am optimistic that things will be working out in the right direction.
We have time for one more question, very quick. Yes.
Thank you very much for the introductions. My question would be related a bit to the fact that for especially global industries, that transparency and security of a rules-based system is very important. So with December this year coming, where the dispute settlement may be paralyzed because there are no longer sufficient judges to make rulings at the appeal stage, my question to you, Mr. Kass, would be, we also heard the EU is at some point working about maybe an alternative mechanism to save the dispute settlement system with those except the United States. Can you share any thoughts on the status or where that is in terms of the progress?
Thank you for your question. As you can imagine, I cannot give you too many details about that, but let me just tell you that the EU, and especially the European Commission, is always prepared to every kind of scenario. But the first and best scenario is that we keep, of course, the current system not only efficient but also operational. We have made some proposals to that sense in Geneva. We hope that these proposals will lead to tangible and concrete progress. In Osaka, as I said, we are very much expecting that the leaders reaffirm their engagement in the reform on the three functions. On that one specifically, I think it's an important question of how to frame this, and now not to finger point to anyone, because if we start doing this, that will not lead to positive results. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that the system needs to work. And so I think we should positively say that the system needs to reinforce. And like the leaders have said, and we very much was in the middle of these discussions last year in Buenos Aires when we negotiated the communique under the Argentinian presidency. If you read carefully the paragraph, we say very much that we stick to multilateralism, we stick to the current system. It has just not delivered as we were expecting it to deliver, and this is why we need to reform it. And of course, we are doing so. But beyond that, let me not comment too much.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Antoine de Cassel, for this opening session. We move right away to the first panel discussion, which is about the EU-Japan Economic Partnership. And we have Sonali, who is from the Kiel Institute for World Economy, who will introduce the panelists. Sonali, you have the floor. So thank you for the ambassador. There are some places here for those who are standing up there. There are some places.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this panel on the EU-Japan agreement, where we'll reflect on the breakthroughs and the opportunities, as the title of the session suggests. We're joined today by three renowned experts on this panel with deep knowledge of EU and Japan economies and their relations. We have Mr. Cohn Burden, Executive Director of International Affairs at EFPIA. That's the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. He's also assistant professor at Erasmus University in Rotterdam and brings to this panel his experience relating to mega trade deals such as the EPA. Next, we'll be joined by Mr. Marco Cirillo, who will share with us his views on the importance of the EPA for achieving EU's economic and strategic objectives. Mr. Cirillo is currently Deputy Head of Unit at DG Trade and also served as Deputy Lead Negotiator of this agreement. Last but not least, we'll have with us Mr. Masahiko Yoshi, who is Professor of Economics and Vice President of Kobe University in Japan. And we look forward to hearing his insights on the Japanese perspectives and expectations from this deal. I'm Sonali Chaudhary. I'll be the moderator for this discussion. I'm currently a research fellow at the Kiel Institute of World Economy, where I focus on EU-Asia trade relations. So I think a good way to kick off this discussion is with a very brief background of the EPA, followed by comments from each of the speakers, and then we open up to Q&A. So as has been mentioned, this agreement entered into force in February of this year and is the largest bilateral deal for the EU so far in terms of market size, covering nearly 640 million consumers and approximately 30% of global GDP in an open and stable trading regime. Therefore, it's impressive not only in terms of the sheer numbers, but also the scope, since the legal text contains several innovations. For example, it has dedicated provisions relating to transparency in corporate governance, to the inclusion of small and medium enterprises, and enhanced regulatory cooperation between parties. Moreover, it is the first FTA to provide space to the parties to reinforce their commitments to the Paris Climate Accord. Therefore, in terms of market size and scope, we can consider the EPA to be a breakthrough effort of EU and Japan to develop models for the new generation of free trade agreements that are cognizant of the distributional and the environmental consequences of globalization. I think it's also crucial to note that this is an agreement between peers. EU and Japan are high-income advanced economies with high regulatory standards. They share fundamental values relating to democratic rights and freedoms, and they are confronted by similar challenges, whether it's WTO reform or the deepening tariff war, or the race towards attracting industries of the future, whether it's artificial intelligence, telecommunications, or robotics. Therefore, the EPA is a platform for EU and Japan to further their common interests on these shared issues as well as on multilateral issues. In a recent study that I co-authored with partners at Bruegel, we examined the economic gains that can be expected from this EPA. And the estimates suggest that the agreement will boost EU's real GDP by 0.14% by 2035, and EU exports to Japan by 13 billion euros. And these main export gains are in the agri-food sector, which benefit from tariff reductions, but also the protection of geographical indications. But there are also gains in manufactured goods like textiles, apparel, and leather products. And on the Japanese side, exports to EU are expected to increase by 22 billion euros. And the main gains will be in manufactured goods, particularly in the automobile sector, where the EU has committed to phase out its tariff on passenger cars over a 7-year period. I think it's important to note that we have some guidance from another agreement, the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which was implemented in 2011, and it shares some similarities with the EU-Japan agreement. There is some common structure in the trade between EU and Korea and EU and Japan, and both the agreements have broadly similar coverage of issues. And so we can look at the ex-post analyses of EU-Korea FTA to have some kind of predictions on the implications of the EU-Japan agreement. And we find that the EU-Korea FTA led to an increase of 42% in EU's exports to Korea and an increase of 0.03% in EU's GDP in the 5 years since. And therefore, these gains, I think, for EU-Japan are a substantial step towards revitalizing EU-Japan trade, which is not as high as one might expect given the importance of their market sizes. Japan accounts for approximately 3% of EU's total exports and 4% of imports, and about 1% of its total investments abroad. So clearly there's a lot of unfulfilled potential that the EPA is trying to address. Beyond these economic advantages, EU and Japan can also benefit from a reduction in trade policy uncertainty, and that's particularly detrimental to the inclusion of small and medium enterprises and the investments in new technologies. In the end, I just have to wrap up and say there's a lot to unpack here, and therefore I invite the panelists to share their comments with us, perhaps beginning with Mr. Burden. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is there a presenter? And maybe we can correct the size of the presentation so that it fits the screen. Yeah. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Koen Berde. I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you very much to SEBS for inviting me and also for organizing this seminar that I think covers two very important elements in the trade discussion that we have today. One, of course, the recently concluded EU-Japan EPA, and the other one being the WTO reform. Both crucial elements when we talk about a let's say, rules-based and predictable, transparent way in which international trade takes place. I'm representing here EFPIA, the European Federation for Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, both large companies and a lot of SMEs. And I think in a way the order of the presentations is kind of reversed because of course we have a very distinguished professor who will say a lot about, let's say, the crucial elements of the EU-Japan EPA. We have one of the chief negotiators on the EU-Japan EPA, and industry in effect is the last of the three, looking at where these trade agreements provide impetus for more trade, for more investment, and for, let's say, business opportunities. But happy to say a few words to you today. So really, I want to focus a little bit on two things. One is to highlight some of the key elements and characteristics of the industry, because that defines to what extent parts of the EPA negotiations are more or less relevant. And the second then is I'd like to turn to the EU-Japan EPA itself and where are the real elements in this EPA that are important for the industry. So starting with the beginning, if we look at the EU trade picture, the pharmaceutical industry is an important contributor to the trade surplus of the European Union. The amount is around 80 billion in 2017 in terms of exports exceeding imports. And I think it's important to say that Japan is in the top 5 trade partners for the pharmaceutical industry in that picture. So the EU-Japan FTA and the EPA is a very important part for us when we look at a trading partner. The other element that matters for us is the pharmaceutical industry is a global industry, and that means also highly specialized. It has to do with R&D, it has to do with production, it has to do with intermediate facilities, and that means when we look at how the European Union's pharmaceutical industry is linked to other countries, we have to look at this from a value chain perspective. We don't produce a medicine from scratch here in Belgium from beginning to end. A lot of products, a lot of services cross borders, and that means the international, let's say, linkages of the trade system matter. And when we look at Japan, Japan has a degree of global value chain integration for our industry that is 3.6%. You see that is behind the US, which is by far the most integrated with the European pharmaceutical industry, and also behind Switzerland, because Switzerland is very close and it also has a very developed pharmaceutical industry. Nonetheless, the global value chain elements linking the EU industry with the Japanese industry are significant. And that means that our industry in Europe contributes to Japanese value in terms of medicines production and exports, and the other way around. Yeah? And within that context, we look at the EPA. So one element is, and I think this is crucial to mention, an important characteristic of our industry is the very high level of R&D expenditure. About 15% of total, if you look there, overall sector R&D intensity as percentage of net sales is 15%. That is by far the highest of the, let's say, industry, so it's a high-tech sector. And with the R&D intensity come challenges. When we look at research and development for a pharmaceutical product, let's say you want a new medicine. How long does it take from the moment we have a molecule that looks promising to the fact you can actually buy a medicine in the pharmacy here outside on the street? The average time is around 9 to 12 years. And that is because from the discovery, the initial discovery and preclinical value of a molecule, a lot of testing has to happen. We call those clinical trial phases 1, 2, and 3, where we have to test and make sure that that molecule develops into something that is not toxic, that is creating in the right doses health benefits to patients, and that eventually has, in large tests and large populations, a positive impact for people who have a certain disease. And you can understand that not one single government in the world would ever allow a medicine onto their market that hasn't been totally tested as much as possible in order to make sure that that has a societal benefit. Out of the 10,000 molecules at the start in the pre-discovery part, 1 or 2 out of those 10,000 make it into a medicine. The rest somehow at some point in the track stops and fails. That's R&D. That's the risk of research and development. So we have 2 elements here that I want to highlight. It is the time period it takes, 9 to 13 years. If something happens when you're halfway this process, rules change, transparency disappears, there is a big shock to the system, you're invested. You can't easily turn that around. So the long-term stability of the trading system is vital. So you understand where I'm going to go when it comes to the EU-Japan EPA. One of the crucial benefits is the stability, the predictability, and the transparency of the system. Irrespective of the exact details of what is in there, there is a clarity that allows longer-term thinking. And for R&D, we have to do longer-term thinking. The other challenge is that with R&D, you have a huge failure rate, a very big risk. And that means, combined with the latest technologies with respect to, for example, rare diseases, the development, the R&D costs for a new biological, a new chemical, are around $2.6 billion. So there lies the dilemma and there lies the challenge at one point. I leave this for time reasons. This is an illustration of the risk that is involved in R&D. You see what happened here in March this year. In the newspaper, it came out that Biogen had withdrawn an Alzheimer's drug candidate out of phase 3, like the final clinical trial phase, and said we withdraw it because it doesn't have the expected positive health effects that we were looking for. Within 1 day, Biogen loses 30% of its value, which is $18 billion. The reason for that is that the stock market punishes the future performance of the company, and this drug, which had high expectations, didn't materialize. Now, that's the risk, and Biogen has invested billions in trying to get that to the level, and it will never see the pharmacy, so you'll never see that. The same went with Celgene in 2017 with a Crohn's disease medicine, Mongersen. So you see, that is the inherent risk. Now, this is the risk that companies have to take. That's the whole idea of R&D, and that's the whole idea of how that works. But we would not want to see an additional risk in terms of arbitrary trade or arbitrary decisions that make it very difficult, even in this R&D market, to operate. So when I then turn for a moment to the free trade agreement element, or in this case, the EPA, there are certain parts in an economic partnership agreement with Japan that are relevant. One is intellectual property rights. If you have to spend $2.6 billion to invest in new medicine, it is important that the investment is recuperated at some point after the medicine comes on the market. That's why we have the intellectual property rights system. Is it a perfect system? No, it's not a perfect system. Is there a better alternative at this moment? No, there isn't a better alternative either. The second part that's really important, and it was mentioned by the keynote speakers a bit earlier today as well, is regulatory cooperation. I'll come to that in a second. The third is market access. To what extent are there any barriers, tariff or non-tariff, that prohibit access to the market? The fourth, tariffs, customs, and rules of origin. And the fifth is also the implementation part. So let me start with the last one and then highlight just a few main elements of the other four. EPA implementation. Of course, a lot of focus has been spent now until February 1st on first negotiating and then ratifying the agreement. I'm sure the next speaker will say a lot more about this. For our industry, of course, what is important is that we see a certain degree of implementation of what has been discussed and been negotiated in practice on the ground. Yeah? And I think when it comes to tariffs, that is easier visible than when it comes to things like regulatory cooperation, because that's a longer term perspective and it's about rules and regulations. So if I highlight a few points on rules of origin and customs. So there are certain elements in the EPA that are important for our industry. And I'm not going to mention all of them. I will give the presentation to Sebs, and I'm happy to share for those of you who want it. But for example, how do customs authorities treat certain active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, as we call them? Do they easily cross the border, or are they subject to a lot of rules and regulations and red tape at the border? Yeah? What are the conditions for manufacturing? So for example, the fifth bullet, it says the value added criterion is now used to determine origin. You see, in our industry, it is all about the value added. You have a certain product that you import, you add value, you export it again as a semi-product, you add value somewhere else, you re-import it, and this can go up and down 6 times before you get to a final product. So that is really important when we look at rules of origin. Also manufacturing processes granting new origin to products. When is a product Japanese and therefore eligible under the EPA, and when is it not Japanese? If you import a certain part of a medicine or a product from China, do something with it in Japan, is it then Japanese? It depends, right? But, for example, chemical reactions, purification, change of particle size, production of standard materials are all reasons for change of origin to Japan. And that means a lot more of our products are suddenly part of the EU-Japan EPA. So these things matter. Intellectual property rights, the IP provisions in the EPA rather confirm, I should make one more point here. From an industry perspective, rules of origin and customs is a complex question. You know, the EU has 53 FTAs, and industry doesn't manage to, in an administrative way, use 53 different rules of origin systems. So what the industry typically does is they take the more stringent rule of origin system and apply it to more FTAs than just one. So for us, it's also important not just to look at the EU-Japan EPA, but also to look at the other agreements that the EU has and which one is the most common denominator to be used. As I said, in intellectual property rights, what matters for us is protection of patents, regulatory data. So regulatory data protection is important. You can imagine that a government says, we want your confidential company data on testing of a medicine before we can ever grant you the authority to sell in our pharmacies. By asking that information, you put company confidential information out there in order to make sure that governments can judge whether or not they think the product is safe and should be available for you as consumers in the pharmacies. But the moment that information becomes available, anyone can use it, unless there is a certain level of protection that you can't just use it after someone has spent 12 years developing something and just take the thing that is out there. So that's why we have things like RDP, for example. This didn't change much in the EPA, but in the agreement, it is now included at the levels that existed in the EU and in Japan. When we talk about regulatory cooperation, I want to highlight the second point, because that's, I think, the main benefit for our industry. It's negotiated in parallel with the EPA. It's the Mutual Recognition Agreement on Good Manufacturing Processes, Good Manufacturing Procedures, GMP. What does that mean? So when we have to produce certain products, there are very strict rules on how to do that. Japan has extremely strict rules. The EU has very strict rules. And what is really important here is that as part of these negotiations, not exactly inside the EPA, slightly different, but still at the same time, what the EU and Japan have done is they have expanded the scope of what they call mutual recognition. So we realize the systems are not identical, but you mutually recognize the similarities between the systems, and therefore you avoid what we call duplicate inspections. You get a Japanese inspection in a production plant in Dublin in Ireland, and you get an EU inspection on the same questions, very similar questions, very similar ideas, and those costs are roughly 350,000 per inspection. So if you halve them by actually mutually recognizing, that is a huge cost saving. What is also important there is that it includes other broader products, so vaccines, for example. It's not totally there yet because there are some elements like IMPs and ATMPs that are not included, but this is a very important element for us. Now, one of the things that links to the introduction speech of our moderator is the fact that on mutual recognition, there is also an evolving process. I think it is very crucial that the EPA has a dialogue, an annual dialogue that allows, stakeholders to come back and say things work or things do not work exactly as planned, and there is a way to kind of look forward to create a dynamic element. Last point from my side before I conclude, we have provisions on non-tariff measures, diverging standards, aligning administrative issues, reducing costs, and also Japan aligning with international standards on pharmaceuticals. So that's, in a nutshell, what is vital. And I think to conclude, there is the perception that the pharmaceutical industry is always about large pharmaceutical companies. And I think what is really crucial to also highlight is that about 27% of the new medicines in the EU are also developed by the smaller companies. And for those SMEs, these regulatory barriers I just highlighted are even more detrimental to become active international or to participate in the value chain than it is for the larger companies. So that is what I wanted to highlight. The last part, linking a little bit to innovation, is PPP, public-private partnerships. The whole Horizon project, where the EU puts a lot of funds via DG Research into certain developments of societal challenges we face with medicines, that is then matched by inputs in terms of research and development for industry, is a very interesting, I think, very promising avenue. And from my visits to Japan in the last year, I noticed a very large interest from the Japanese side in seeing how such a system, the public-private partnership element, could actually benefit Japanese society and in Japan. There are a few points in terms of expansion or where to go further. There are improvements to be made when it comes to recognition of inspections. For example, there is still a lot of paper-based inspection. Some files have 10,000 pages of dossier in order to go through before you get an approval. 10,000 pages. If that needs to be translated into Japanese, you can imagine what that means. That's not, even though it sounds like a translation question, it's a big question potentially. So reducing paper-based for digital, making a system that makes dossiers available is very important. There are some elements that could be included in the MRA. And the other element that we think is relevant is on good clinical practice. 9 years we spend on clinical trial work. Now the Japanese have very high standards on clinical trials too. So does the EU. So there are some potential gains to be made, but that is to be for the future. And of course, the last point for trade experts here in the room, a very open door, but any international agreement has to also be flanked in a positive way by domestic policies in order to reap benefits. If the domestic policy goes counter the FTA, some of the potential gains are offset by what happens domestically. I know that is not the remit of the EPA, for example, in case there are differences in domestic policies, but it matters also for Japan. I leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions later on. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Marco Chirullo, Deputy Head of Unity DG Trade and Deputy Chief Negotiator of the EU-Japan EPA. So a lot has already been said about the agreement, so I won't recall all the details, but I'll be happy to get into the details in the questions and answers session should you have specific questions. I think what I'd like to focus is on the strategic importance, what is really relevant, why this agreement is in a way a game changer. And I'll point at a few elements that, in my opinion, support the idea that that this EU-Japan EPA is in a way a unique agreement, and it's not only because of its because of the importance of the two trade partners, but also for the very nature of the agreement and the moment it was negotiated and it entered into force. So I would start by highlighting the moment, the period in which this agreement has been negotiated and entered into force. It has been evoked by previous speakers, but just to give you an idea, after 4 years of negotiations, a bit more, we finalized the negotiations in December 2017. We then signed the agreement in July 18. We ratified on both sides by the end of the year 18, and 2 months later it entered into force. So if you're a little bit familiar with usual times, that was quite of a way of getting enemies in the house, because that sets bad precedents in terms of efficiency for trade agreements. But the truth is that that was a powerful sign to the world, but also to European citizens. So starting from the words, there's no doubt that the message was also a strategic response to an increasingly inward-looking tendency in the international trading system. It was mentioned even by Ambassador Kodama. It came at a point where Japan and the EU, not two minor actors, suddenly stood together and reaffirmed fundamental principles of openness, fairness of trade, of the importance of working on international standards towards a fair and free trading system. And the other important message was to the European constituencies. The trade can deliver benefits to citizens, consumers, to business in a relatively, or actually in a very short time frame. And that was also a response to a request coming from the outside world, from our very constituencies. An important element of this agreement was again evoked is the nature of the agreement. It's not a classic tariff focused agreement. So actually it wasn't the case either for the EU Korea FTA, but in this case the agreement expanded the areas covered in the text. The SME chapter was mentioned. The trade and sustainable development chapter is quite extensive in coverage. First agreement covering the commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement, for instance. A specific chapter, and I'll get back to that, focusing on regulatory cooperation and an anti-fraud clause. So it is an agreement which extended significantly the areas covered in trade compared to traditional trade agreements. And but if I had to mention, I will not focus, but happy to expand if you want afterwards, how ambitious it is in public procurement, in GIs, which is certainly important areas especially from a European perspective, but actually the Japanese have bought the idea and they're actually enjoying it quite importantly. But I would like to focus on those elements which have a fundamental strategic value, which is what in 10 years, if we make a good use of this agreement, this is what will be left in 10, 20 years from now, which is what we have done on non-tariff measures. And again, it was just about international standards. At a certain point during the negotiation, the strategic choice was made by the EU and the Japanese side to work together to strengthen international standards. And that across the board. It was mentioned in the pharma sector, but the SPS sector is a classic one. Food additives is an area where there's been a convergence towards international standards. But you name it, cosmetics, medical devices, the automotive sector with Japan endorsing the UNICE regulations. We're talking about a massive number of non-tariff measures that have been removed, modified, adjusted by the Japanese side in accordance with international standards. And by the way, I have to praise with great pleasure the Japanese side, because many of those measures were removed or adjusted before the entry into force of the agreement, or actually even before the end of the negotiations in some cases. So there was, let's call it an early advance payment on the Japanese side, which was remarkable from that point of view, which makes nowadays possible to say that part of the agreement is already enforced and producing effects from day one, and not only the tariff part, which by definition is easier to measure in terms of implementation. That is the strategic value. Why? Because this agreement has provided us with a real convergence, regulatory convergence, and based on international standards. And that is what we can build on, and what will remain once the transitional period for tariffs will be completed for those transitional periods which are in place, while we will have all enjoyed zero duties on the very large majority of our respective tariff lines. We will soon forget that, but actually what will remain is the ability to work together to produce regulatory convergence, and that is between us, because we are now obtained that convergence, but over time products evolve, and there's the digital era we are in. Artificial intelligence is an example. The new green economy products, in all those areas, we will continue to produce international our regulations. And one thing is if we do it jointly or based on jointly agreed shared principles. Another thing is that whether if from now on we keep regulating on each side on its own, and then in 10 years' time we are back to the starting point. What this agreement provides for is exactly the tools to avoid that happens with the regulatory cooperation chapter, which provides the forum for the two sides to meet, to identify the regulatory priorities, and to work on those emerging regulatory priorities or emerging regulatory efforts which are in the pipeline, to make sure that our respective approaches converge and are fully compatible. And so that is for me a key fundamental leftover and an opportunity that the agreement is leaving behind for us to take up. If we put that into a broader perspective, our respective FTAs, trade policies, bilateral trade agreements being negotiated, the EU-Japan EPA is clearly a state-of-the-art agreement. So it incorporates the latest evolution of the thinking. It is also the result of the trade policy, let's be frank, being tested by the political arena, by decision makers, by the European Parliament, by stakeholders. The EU-Japan EPA has incorporated all these elements, providing a response to the concerns. And it is, as I was saying, a state-of-the-art agreement, which then provides a model for the ongoing negotiations, and which is, of course, from an EU perspective, fully compatible and with the existing trade agreements, some of which have been negotiated more or less in parallel or just before. The EU-Vietnam agreement, Singapore, the very agreement with Korea. There are ongoing negotiations with Australia and New Zealand. We have other plans in the ASEAN region with other trade partners. All that will create a network, and is creating a network of FTAs, and Japan has its own network of trade agreements, which on both sides will basically underpin and strengthen those kind of principles based on respect, strengthening, reinforcement of international standards, and the fundamental principles which are supporting our effort in the non-tariff measures in the area of non-tariff removal of non-tariff measures. So that again is part of what I was referring to in terms of strategic importance of this agreement. Another thing which I find important, and it was mentioned by Professor Burden on when he said not everything is in the agreement. The benefits are not just in the details, but it also comes from a general convergence, which can be a convergence of value, but actually it's a convergence of mindsets and also of mutual trust. I was in Paris for an event, and a speaker presented a joint venture between an SME, a French SME, and a Japanese one on floating windmills. I mean, it is an issue in Japan because of the type of coasts. You can't have a lot of fixed windmills. And then the question from the floor was, has the agreement helped with that? And they said, no, actually, because we had the joint venture signed before the end of the negotiations. But the overall context, yes, it did help. And I have several signs of that. There's a convergence of approaches and reinforcement of mutual trust, which will also contribute to strengthening our partnership. Now, that of course doesn't has to be coupled with a thorough follow-up to the negotiations, and I would just spend the last few words on the way forward and the priorities from now on. And I would summarize them by saying implementation, implementation, implementation. This is what we hear from member states. This is what we hear from the European Parliament, and I have no doubt that we will hear it the same way from the newly elected MEPs. And certainly we just heard it from stakeholders, and we hear that on a daily basis from stakeholders. It is important to prove that all the efforts which comes with the negotiation is actually backed by a lot of focus on the way the agreement is implemented. We have an institutional setup for that. We already had the first joint committee at the level of the Commissioner Malmström, and Foreign Affairs Minister Kono. We have a number of sectoral working groups. I will not detail them, but basically every area of the agreement is backed by the institutional setting, allowing to take up any problems in the implementation that might come up. And part of that is also making sure that we work very closely with stakeholders and with member states, because we can negotiate the agreements, we can make all the efforts to undergo all the procedures to have an early entry into force, but as you know, trade promotion is not an exclusive competence of the EU. We need the member states, we need trade associations, we need business, and there's a lot of work going into that. And I see here my friend Hiro Inoue, whom we keep meeting in the capitals around Europe, giving speeches and participating to seminars whose objective is spreading the verb, but also in a way pushing the private sector and all the relevant stakeholders to engage. And that, of course, makes events like this one even more relevant, because it's another opportunity to go in depth and also to recall everyone's duty to make his own part to make of the EPA a real success. As it seems to be for the initial 3 months. I've heard nice figures. I'm always very cautious, but they keep appearing in newspapers here and there. And I keep talking to industry from different member states who seem to be quite happy about the trade figures we're seeing. So I'll stop there. I'm very happy afterwards to take questions.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yoshi from Kobe University, and I'm very happy to speak on the topic of Japan EU EPA. I'm sorry, but I used to say Japan EU EPA, not EU Japan EPA. So at first, I would like to show an outline of the. Okay, sorry. At first, I would like to show you an outlines of Japan EU trade. The blue line is the Japanese export to the European Union, and red line is Japanese import from the European Union, and the black line shows the trade balance. So in the beginning, from the 1970 and to the beginning of 1990s, Japanese trade surplus always increased. But after our collapse of the bubbles in the beginning of 1990s, Japanese trade surplus with the European Union fluctuated. Sorry, just a little bit smooth because the figures. So maybe 2 trillion yen to 4 trillion yen. And the peak was in 2008, 7 and 8. But after the collapse, after the Lehman shock, global financial crisis in 2008, the situation totally changed. This trade balance started to decline, and after the Eastern Japan earthquake in 2011, Japanese trade surplus trade balance became negative with the European Union. Why? So the biggest reason is the decrease of export from Japan. That is, we lost our competitiveness, especially in the electric appliances, such as liquid panel appliances and so on. So we are now, in the 1970s, Japanese people are criticized as workaholics living in the rabbit hutches, but we are not such an enemy from the European side. Next, what traded? So in the left, it's a Japanese export to the European Union. And the biggest item is transport equipment, motor vehicles and parts of motor vehicles. The biggest item is machinery. It accounts for 26.5%. And next, transport equipment, more than 20%. And the third, electric machineries. So that 2/3 of Japanese export to the European Union is explained by the exports of machineries. But on the right, it's Japanese import from the European Union. The first, of course, we import transport equipment, cars from the European Union. but it explains only 11%, a little bit smaller than that of Japanese export. And the biggest items is not transit equipment or machineries, but chemicals, chemical materials, especially pharmaceutical products. So I think there is a reason why Dr. Burden was invited to this seminar. And also there is a big difference in the agricultural products. We, Japan, do not export agricultural products to the European Union, but the almost more than 10% of Japanese import from the European Union is explained by the agricultural products. So, this composition of the imports and export can explain the motivation of the interests of Japan and the European Union in the FTA negotiations. And this is a chronology of Japan EU EPA. So the first motivation is the rumor the EU-Korean FTA negotiations started in 2007. And just before the negotiation, starting of the negotiation, Keidanren, Japan Business Association, proposed to the Japanese government to start to conclude Japan-EU EPA, and blah blah blah. And the second, there are second and series of motivations. First, the East Japan earthquake. So the European, not only the European Union, but also many other countries assist to recover the Japanese economy. And the second, China's growing up in the world economy. Especially AIIB was established in 2013. And the third motivation is the showing up of President Trump. And on these motivations, as in 2017, the EPA was agreed in general, and anyhow, this February, Japan-EU EPA came into force. And so, as I showed in the previous slides, interests of both parties were different. Japanese side demanded to eliminate high tariffs of industrial products, especially motor cars and electronic appliances. The European Union side demanded Japan to eliminate non-tariff measures, to eliminate non-tariff barriers on automobiles, chemicals, blah, 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 blah. And also to increase the, to make the government procurement easier to the European Union. And lastly, the European Union eliminate of tariffs on the main export products, especially agricultural products. This is the list of chapters. It is almost the same as in the EU-Korea FTA, but the order is different and size are different. And so we can summarize the impacts of Japan-EU EPA are. So this EPA is a mega FTA between two biggest economic areas, and the EPA eliminate the high-level tariffs in both sides, and it includes not only the tariff reduction or elimination, but also other non-tariff measures. And and also, at the time of the conclusion of EPA, strategic partnership agreement was also concluded. So we hope this EPA and SPA will give a very big positive impacts on both sides. So this is a summary of the agreement that I skip. And but on the tariff elimination, the biggest, as I said, the biggest Japanese demand was the automobile tariff elimination on the automobiles. So EU will eliminate tariffs on automobiles in 8 years, their part in 9 years. So 7 years transition period. It is longer than the FTA between Korea and the European Union, 5 years. But anyhow, we are very glad to see this elimination of tariffs on the automobiles by the EU side. And Japan will eliminate various agricultural products, especially wine instantly, pasta, chocolates, and leather products in 11 years, and so on. And as I said, not only the tariff elimination, but also there are many non-tariff measures. And there are, but it is because of the time shortage, I can skip. I would like to skip. And as to the non-tariff measures, as the former speakers told, Japanese automobiles regulations, it's not itself changed, but Japanese automobile safety regulations have to consult with the UNECE regulations. So we should follow the European standards. And also government in the government procurement and IP, intellectual properties, geographic indicators, corporate governance, and IO provisions. There are many changes of Japanese side positions. And before the conclusion of the Japan-EU EPA, many economists, researchers made an estimation of the effect of the impacts of Japan-EU EPA, and all of most of these researches showed a positive and very big impact of the FTA. And for example, Japanese government report said that the Japan-EU EPA will raise the real GDP by 0.99%, labor supply by 0.4%, and Commission, this report says, positive increase by the FTA. And the size of the market is bigger in the European. The market size of the European Union is bigger than that of Japan. So this figure is smaller. Japanese figure is much bigger, but totally Japanese EU impacts will be bigger. So not the real figures of the EU increase is much bigger. And one more thing. So yesterday I talked with Ambassador Kodama, and we agreed that the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, is the baseline of the Japan-EU EPA. And especially in the agricultural sectors, the conclusion of the tariff reduction and tariff elimination of the TPP 12 or TPP 11 is the baseline of the Japan-EU EPA. And of course, at first, Japan did not concede in the rice import. And in the case of EU trade with the European Union, wheat is not a matter. But in the case of beef and pork, the same measures are used in the Japan EU EPA and TPP 11. And as I told, the tariff on the Japanese import of wine was eliminated on the day of implementation, 1st of February. And this is the Japanese import of wine from France, Spain, and Italy. I cannot have enough time to calculate all the 28 member countries. And blue line and red line shows imports of in 2017 and 2018. And very interestingly, the beginning imports of wine in January, just before 1 month of implementation, dropped down. So the Japanese importers of wine refrained from importing wine from the European Union. But after the implementation, Japanese wine import from these 3 countries increased very much. So this is one good example of the impacts of this FTA. And this is my own calculation. So in 2018, EU imported almost 6 million cars from Japan. If the tariff had been eliminated, 10% tariff, if the tariff on automobiles of 10% had been eliminated, and customers had faced car prices without custom tariffs, imported cars from Japan could have been increased by almost 400,000 units. So we hope this FTA could have both could have positive and very big positive impacts on both sides. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
I'd like to call all the speakers to join me on the podium for a short Q&A with the audience. Okay, so I guess we have around 15 minutes. We'll take a bunch of questions and, okay, they're already raised hands, great. One from you, sir, and then followed by you.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Hans-Günther Hilpert. I'm from Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik from Berlin. I have a question to Professor Yoshi and Mr. Shiruya. Well, the agreement will prompting lots of trade creating effects, and it's a very good agreement. Nevertheless, I would like to ask for 2 points. First, there won't be only winners, there will be also some losers. And the losers may be the European automotive industries. If tariffs are dismantled and if the European automotive industry is also struggling with low carbon and with digitalization, that may be a problem. And in Japan, it's agriculture, especially the dairy industry. So my question would be, what will happen if these industries are getting into real trouble? Will there be a reassessment? And the second question would be especially to Japan. Japan, if you compare Japan's integration into world economy, it's still a rather closed economy. So shares of imports in GDP is around 12%. In France, it's 24%, Germany, Korea, it's 30%. Export share is also very low. share of FDI to GDP is quite low. So what kind of difference will this agreement make? And also, of course, TPE 11. I think there's quite real dismantling of NTBs and also of tariffs. It's not all, there are still NTBs in Japan. There are still also many informal barriers. But what would be your assessment? What could difference this agreement make? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Gabriele Gaiani. I'm a professor at Bocconi University in Milan, Italy. I have three brief questions for Mr. Carullo. So the first one is investment, protection of investment, so not market access for investment, which is out of the table of the EPA, but still apparently there is some sort of proposal for the standing court with Japan. Do we really need that between two advanced economies? I mean, where standards of protection for investors under national laws, in the case of EU, not really national laws, but I mean, EU law and national laws are very high. Second question, you were mentioning ASEAN. So the agreement with Vietnam, the legal scrapping took 3 years, 2015, 2018, and negotiations with Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand seems to be I don't know, like on the high seas. So is there something moving there or not? Since you were mentioning those countries. Third and last one, you were talking about GIs. Now, on the one hand, there seems to be a momentum for the EU and the EPA, but also in the CETA, partial victory. While on the other hand, we know that in the USMCA, there is a sort of maybe offsetting clause. And the Geneva Act to the Lisbon Agreement at WIPE in 2015 was not probably a big success. So what would be the vision of the Commission? Is there a momentum for GIs? Is it a victory? Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe from here, the lady.
Thank you very much. My name is Maaike Okeno-Heijmans from Klingendael Institute in The Hague. Thank you for three interesting presentations. What strikes me is that the two keynote speeches very much addressed digital economy. And whereas your speeches hardly mentioned the topic, if at all. So allow me a question about that. Of course, e-commerce is included in the EPA. Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on how that provision relates to all the efforts in the WTO to get to a broader agreement. Is this also a push? And if so, how? And then on that other element that was mentioned in the previous session, data protection and the free flow of data free flow of trust. I believe that Prime Minister Abe calls it. Is the data protection agreement that the EU and Japan also sort of have their, mutually adequacy decision on in last January, is that also a push for that agreement to be brought to a multilateral fora? And if so, how? Thank you.
Can I ask a question? So Ines Bria from Senelec, making standards for Europe. I wanted to have more information on the regulatory cooperation you mentioned, especially in terms of implementation, and you also mentioned working more closely with the stakeholders. How would that work? Do you have any already foreseen steps, such as working groups or feedbacks from the industry as well on the barriers that they will still face in terms of standards and acceptance? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I guess we can start answering that very, very good list of questions.
That's all. So I'll take. I hadn't. All right, now I think it's going. Right? Yes. Okay, so the issue of the losers, winners of the agreement. On the one hand, it is a fact that you have those benefiting more than others from the agreement. I have to say that this is probably a case where you identify much more winners than losers, just because of the nature of the two economies that are highly complementary. And two examples were made: cars and cheese. There are two elements. There was a fundamental element which was constantly part of the negotiations, which was not to have sectors or areas brutally penalized, let's put it like that. Cheese was a sensitive issue on the Japanese side, and that's why there was a choice on the Japanese government side to protect soft cheese more, and that's why there's a duty-free quota for that sector, whereas there's free liberalization for hard cheeses. So the sector where Hokkaido, the island of Hokkaido, was under pressure because of this dairy sector, that was taken into account. There's no full liberalization for all the dairy products outside cheese, for instance, not all of them. Some are particularly protected from a Japanese perspective. When it comes to cars, it's clear that the transitional period is quite long and longer than what we had in the past, and with quite significant perspective also for exports. One thing, for example, which I could see as part of during the negotiating process, I would regularly go to Tokyo. And from one time to another, I could see simply more German cars or Italian cars present, circulating in Tokyo, as much as I could see retailers in town, which were not allowed previously in town. Foreign retailers were not allowed in town. So if you have to buy a car and you have to get outside a big town like Tokyo, you might be more likely to bump into a Toyota retailer that is next door than if you have to look for a Peugeot 30 kilometers from you. So there's also a perspective. There's the experience of the EU-Korea FTA, which certainly played a role, because data after the agreement were very positive, and in a way counterbalance the fears at the time. There's a system in place which is linked to the NTMs, the removal of non-tariff measures in the automotive sector, and the guarantee that those NTMs cannot be reintroduced. There's a period of 10 years whereby we can unilaterally increase tariffs if we see that on the Japanese side there's the intentional or unintentional reintroduction of non-tariff measures. Unilaterally, we first do it and then we discuss, which is quite of a forceful tool. Then I would make a general consideration, which is the economic model of Japan and the EU, which is different. We are, to a large extent, a trading actor. We go to third partners and we trade, we sell. The Japanese are an economy modeled around investment-based trade. They establish themselves, they start producing, and they sell on the ground. There will be increases possible in terms of sales, exports from Japan into Europe, but a great deal of the production is based in Europe, also close to Brussels, in Europe, and is deemed to stay there. Because that's very much the model Japan has always used. And by the way, there are EU established by now, since decades. And so that is also, in terms, if we look at different models, quite of a reassuring element. And it's also part of the complementarity we have in terms of economies, which made the negotiations possible. In terms of protection of investment, do we really need it? My first answer would be from a structural point, systemic point of view, it would be very useful. if we could actually agree on two major actors on the standards to start with. Then I'm sure that if you ask around operators, you would find some who would say, I want it. I mean, if you invest, even in the safest place for an investor, if you have guarantees, that's quite a reassuring element. So if the underlying question is, are the EU and Japan an unstable environment for investors? No. But that I'm sure is not enough of a guarantee for investors. So the idea is to keep negotiating, and I will not hide that there's a fundamental element there on which we have diverging views for the time being, which is the investment core system. But we keep negotiating, meeting, and on these. The ASEAN. Well, we have, as was mentioned, we have already negotiated Singapore and Vietnam, which hopefully will soon produce effects. We have the possibility to advance with other ASEAN countries, with whom, in some cases, for political reasons, we have not proceeded. So if the political environment evolves, we shall see. As a matter of fact, this agreement, as much as the other agreements, provide a good hub for the region anyway, I have to say. But of course, if we could have extend that network, that is among the trade priorities we have established. Yeah, sorry. GIs, momentum for GIs, Japan, yes. It's a clear momentum. More than 200 GIs fully protected. Some with standards which were unprecedented. I think that is, and on top of that, with a major actor such as Japan, which didn't have GIs, and which is now, I made a reference to that. They actually might make a broader use of that and enlarge the list in the future, because they do have a basis of traditional products to promote. So I think that is definitely even a strategic success of the EU, apart from the economic benefit of it. E-commerce, yes, I didn't mention it, but it's a quite advanced chapter on e-commerce with a lot of provisions. It's actually the most advanced e-commerce chapters. My e-commerce colleagues, experts, used to say, in terms of provisions related to the practicalities of the e-commerce business. The data protection was addressed in a separate agreement. Whether that is underpins the WTO negotiations or the Japanese proposal are in support to the WTO negotiations. There's someone who's much more qualified here to respond, my colleague Mito Zambarta, so she will certainly be able to go further. But I mean, as long as we stick to the fundamental principles which are enshrined in the bilateral agreement on data protection we have with Japan, and our vision about the importance of data protection, then they can mutually support each other. Especially the Japanese proposal, and that is certainly a fundamental prerequisite for us. And regulatory cooperation, we are starting now to look into that with the Japanese. We'll have before the end of the year, we'll have the first meeting of the working group of the Committee on Regulatory Cooperation. The idea is to identify sectors and to ask also the industrial sector or the stakeholders to come up with suggestions, and possibly joint suggestions, the Japanese and the EU side, of what should be given priority and what we should focus on. And based on that, we could establish ad hoc working groups to look into the specifics. I think I replied to everything.
Okay, great. Perhaps we can have very short final remarks from Mr. Yoshi and Mr. Burden.
Okay. First, as to the losers, of course, Mr. Chiruo told, in Japan, agricultural farmers are losers in the case of Japan EU EPA, especially in the dairy products. So Japanese government decided to give subsidies to the dairy products farmers, which will have a negative impacts from this agreement. I'm not sure. I'm sorry, but I forgot the number of the subsidies. And the second, as the first question is from, so of course, Japan is still a closed economy, but relatively, Japan is a little bit wider, became much opener than before. In the beginning of 2000s, Japanese openness index, that is the trade over export over GDP, was less than 10%. So at that time, there were three big countries whose openness index was less than 3: Japan, the United States, and Brazil. But today, as you said, the relative index is more than half, 15%. But we should not stop here. So we should open our doors to the outside. And I think the Japan-EU EPA will give a big impetus to this dimension. But not that Japan-EU EPA will not give directly clue impetus to our openness. But Japan-EU EPA will be a baseline of RCEP, free trade negotiation with China, Korea, India, Australia, and TPP-11 and this EPA will be a big baseline of this negotiation. So based on this negotiation, Japan will be able to create much bigger global supply chains among the Asian and Pacific regions. Of course, Japan-EU EPA will not give an impetus to create, enlarge our global supply chain to the European Union. It is too far. But as I said, Japan EPA will give indirect impetus to create, to extend our global supply chains to in the Asia and Pacific region. So I hope, and I'm sorry, but I'm not. I have not researched on the digital economy, so I will try to. And thank you very much.
Two very short points, really, on the digital economy. I think I made one point about the paper-based inspections. That is definitely a potential for more digitization. The other element there, I think, from an industry perspective, what matters is think about how, in practice, there would be testing, for example, with patients of innovative medicines. If that happens globally, you would want to share databases, because that leads to a much larger population for testing and for results. Especially when you talk about children, there are often very small numbers of patients, children patients, who would work with a certain medicine. If you can't share under certain conditions data globally, you have a big challenge, because there are not that many underaged patients, for example, in Japan with a very specific disease. So you would have challenges there. So digitalization is very important. And I think it also links a little bit to the healthcare system as a whole. Artificial intelligence, how patients in remote areas in a country get access to top quality healthcare, links a lot to how you digitize your system. So I think there are some very important elements there, and the EPA gives some let's say, handles to work on that. Regarding regulatory cooperation, I would rather echo a little bit what was said before. We noticed that the more you discuss, the more you work with stakeholders, the more you have regulators engage both with each other as well as with those that are being regulated, the more understanding and trust you create in order to make those steps. And that's not going to happen within 6 months, even though I think negotiation processes have positive dynamics among negotiators and regulators. But we see over periods of 5 to 10 years massive differences in which you can agree. And one example there is, for example, third country inspections. Imagine that you talk about inspecting factories in China, and the EU does not have enough inspection capacity to inspect every factory. But if an EU-Japan FTA means that the Japanese inspections also in China would actually be done in a complementary way, not to double inspect the same factory, you expand your scope in a third country by cooperating in a regulatory space in third countries far beyond, let's say, just EU-Japan. This is an example that is actually being discussed now in CETA, in the EU-Canada FTA for third country inspections. These kind of things have global implications in that sense. Thank you.
Before the end of this session, I would like to advertise one thing. On 22nd of October, Kobe University will have a symposium with the UVV. And the first session will treat with this Japan, EU, EPA, and SPA. So if you have time, please join again to our Kobe University symposium with VV. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, it's time to conclude this panel. Thank you to the speakers for their enriching discussion, to the audience for their wide-ranging questions, and to SEPS for organizing and bringing us together.
As I suggested that we could have probably 5 minutes and then we reconvene at 1:45 for those who want to have a glass of water or so. And then Shara will come up and chair the next panel.
moderate this session. I'm Shada Islam from Friends of Europe. So our discussion today is about how we can reform and review the processes of the World Trade Organization. And I think you'll all agree with me that the rules-based global trading order has served us well for about almost 65 to 70 years, the GATT and now the WTO. But I think you'll also agree with me that it's broken, so we have to fix it. So what's broken it? I think the WTO was already fraying at the edges until America first arrived on the scene. And of course, protectionism, nationalism, ethno-nationalism, economic nationalism are fragilizing the system even more. We have also US-China trade tensions, and earlier you heard about how that's creating uncertainty for industry and governments. And I think the common challenge facing the facing the European Union and Japan is to duck out of the crossfire, not to be caught in the crossfire. So we say that it's broken, let's fix it, but it's not that easy to walk this talk. We heard this morning from Kodama-san that the G20 summit in Osaka will give a political impetus to the WTO reform efforts. We heard also about the trilateral cooperation, and of course, EU and China also have their own working group on WTO reform. Ideally, of course, they should be talking to each other all the time, as was pointed out earlier by a participant, but okay, this may happen later on. So the question facing our panelists today is, how do we actually go and reform the WTO? How do you make it relevant and credible in today's very volatile and turbulent world? I have with me today Professor Yuka Fukumaga, professor from Waseda University. Yuka, welcome. Mirto Zambarta, head of WTO unit at DG Trade at the European Commission. And last but not least, Hiro Inoue, Executive Director of the Japan External Trade Office in Brussels. So Professor Yuka, I'm going to start with you. We're going to speed up the process a tiny little bit because Gunnar Wiegand from the External Action Service will be here in about 15 minutes or so. So Professor Yuka, you have some slides. I'd encourage you to come here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I want to extend my gratitude to the organizer for inviting me here in this very important conference. And the audience I have here is very different from the audience I normally have, so I'm very happy to be here. Now, because I only have 10 minutes, I try to be brief. Now it's 3:52, so I'll try to finish my slides perhaps at 4 or maybe 4:02. Okay, how can I? Okay, this one. How can I move this slide? The right arrow, this one. It's not moving. Help.
さっきの黒い
これですよね。
こっちですか。動かない。
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Great. Right. So we all know that we have to reform WTO. So I'll skip this slide. And we all know that there are two aspects in the WTO reform. One is the rulemaking, and the other is dispute settlement. So I finished the slides. And I'll start with the rulemaking. And we know that the WTO has made only a limited success in some subjects, and we have more failures than successes. So we have to change the situation. And we have some ongoing attempts, ongoing negotiations, but we don't know whether these negotiations will produce any results. But however, there are some positive developments in the field of electronic commerce. We have discussed some issues regarding electronic commerce. And there are some joint declarations to confirm intention to commence WTO negotiations. And as some speakers have already mentioned, Prime Minister Abe said that she wants Osaka summit to be a start of the talk on data governance. Now, and there are many key issues in e-commerce, but I don't discuss those detailed issues. But what I want to provoke is a question. those talks are seeking to adopt an agreement, either multilateral or plurilateral. But I want to ask you, is it really effective to adopt either multilateral or plurilateral agreement to deal with e-commerce? Because e-commerce, well, there are actually two messages that I want to deliver in this today's speech. And one of them is that e-commerce is very different from the traditional, conventional trading goods. And perhaps the way we have dealt with conventional trading goods may not be effective to deal with e-commerce. This is my first message. And in order to highlight the difference between conventional trading goods and e-commerce, this is a slide I spent most of my preparation time, and I tried to find good analogies to highlight the difference, but I didn't succeed. But anyway, for the conventional trade negotiations, we have the image of walls. And I think conventional trade negotiations is a karate practitioner who is trying to break the walls. I think we can share this image. And this process can be slow. We can meditate before the walls, and we can progressively break the walls. But e-commerce is very different. And I tried to find a good analogy, good metaphor for the e-commerce negotiations, but I didn't succeed. But the image I got is this whack-a-mole game. I don't know if you ever played this game. I'm very good at it. And so I can see that you understand the concept. And in the e-commerce, it's not like e-commerce is inherently free, inherently borderless, but some governments introduce some regulations, interferences, and they keep changing those regulations. So we have to be very quick to deal with new situations. We have to deal with new regulations, new interferences. So the point I want to make is that the process of the e-commerce negotiations has to be very quick, very flexible, and very responsive. So this is why earlier I provoked whether a multilateral or plurilateral agreement can be effective to deal with e-commerce. And think about it. The Uruguay round took 8 years to conclude, and the trade facilitation agreement took more than 20 years to come into force. If we spend more than 20 years on the negotiation of e-commerce, we can't agree on anything effective. 20 years from now, e-commerce is very different. So what I want to say is that perhaps making an agreement may not be a good way. We have to think about other alternatives, like maybe we can adopt guidelines, or maybe we can adopt a model law, or maybe we should not adopt anything, and we just need to have sort of a framework to allow discussions just to go on. So this is my first message. And now it's 3:58, so I'll be very, very brief about the dispute settlement. And well, again, this is very clear. The appellate body is in crisis. Let me skip this. And I'm very aware that we should keep talks on this appellate body's reform. We have to find out how to break this impasse. However, I think I want to highlight this. This impasse is not created because of the conceptual difference. We all agree that there is a limit to the appellate body's mandate, and the appellate body has to comply with that scope of the mandate. But the disagreement does not lie in the conceptual concept of the appellate body. The disagreement lies in the factual recognition. The disagreement exists as to what the appellate body has done. At least one member is saying that the appellate body exceeded its mandate, but perhaps many other members do not share that view. And to me, as long as there is a factual difference, members cannot reach an agreement on the appellate body's reform. So my second message, my second important message for today's speech is that we have to be ready for the world without the upper body. So this is the message. Functioning one-tiered dispute settlement is better than the incapacitated two-tiered dispute settlement. And if we just keep trying to improve the upper body, we lose everything, but we cannot lose everything. We have to make sure that the WTO can go on even without the upper body. So how can we do that? Well, some speakers have mentioned that the EU has already made a proposal to use arbitration under Article 25 as an alternative to the appellate body. But I personally don't share that view, because two-tiered dispute settlement system has its value because one of the stages, one of the processes is permanent, standing. One stage is an ad hoc body and the other one is permanent. That's why two-tiered dispute settlement works well. If we create arbitration instead of the appellate body, the arbitration is also ad hoc. And so if we try to use arbitration as an alternative to the appellate body, it seems like we have two panel stages. So my proposal is, rather than using arbitration instead of the appellate body, members should agree not to appeal panel reports. And by agreeing that, I think we can make sure that the WTO dispute settlement keeps working without the appellate body. Thank you very much.
Professor Yuka, thank you very much indeed. Two very innovative concepts and ideas, proposals to put on the table, and I think that's exactly what we need. Perhaps we need to talk about revision, recreation, rather than just reform or transformation, the buzzword of the 21st century. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there's going to be questions about your 2 points, e-commerce or Jack in the Box kind of trade negotiations need not perhaps an agreement, but something more fluid, and also that one-tiered dispute settlement, no appeals, should be envisaged. Thank you very much. So, Maito, I'm going to actually ask you to give us the EU point of view, right? And also, Maito, if you could touch on these two issues as well, please. Floor is yours.
Does it? Okay, works. Hi everyone. I'm Mirto Zambarta. I am the head of unit in Digitrade on, among other things, WTO policy. I've been in the post for almost 2 years, and I picked a good time, I think, to take on this job. As the previous speaker said, we all know that the WTO is in crisis. We share the assessment as to why, although I have heard a lot about what the EU thinks are the consequences of, or rather the symptoms of the crisis, which is unilateral measures, protectionism, but we think that it goes deeper than that, that the root causes of the crisis are actually go deeper, and that they can be summarized into 3 baskets of issues. One is the failure of the WTO to evolve as technology evolved, so it has not caught up with the development in global trade and the very exciting but also very disruptive technology that we have at our disposal now that affects global trade. The lack of a level playing field and the lack of tools to address the market distortions that we see now caused by practices of some of our trading partners, like massive subsidization, like unfair advantages given to domestic entities, like the distortive preferences given to state-owned enterprises, for example. And finally, the lack of tools to deal with the effects of globalization, or the lack of attention that we have paid to the effects of globalization and the need to foster sustainability. As a result of those, I think we see what we see now. We in the Union, we tried to react as early as possible. We issued a concept paper of our outline of what we think is necessary to bring the WTO back to where it belongs, which is at the center of trade liberalization, at the center of trade rulemaking. And it is important that we look at it from across its three functions. So negotiating, monitoring, and dispute settlement. I won't bore you that the paper's been out long enough. I'm sure you're familiar with it, so I won't bore you with the details. The main issue is, in negotiation is, okay, we have identified what we feel is necessary. We're open to addressing other issues as well. So for example, a lot of WTO members keep referring back to the DDA, and they need to address the issues there. But what is more fundamental is the how. It is, with 164 members, it is almost impossible to act fast and to be bold. So we need new ways of reaching agreement on new rules. And plurilateral efforts are not, might be the solution. We saw in the Buenos Aires Ministerial Conference a series of joint statements made by like-minded members on e-commerce, on domestic regulation, on investment facilitation, saying this is what we think we need to do to make sure that the rules catch up with the realities of global trade now. Join us or not, we're going to do it. And this is not new. We don't think that this in any way undermines multilateralism. Most of what you see now in the Uruguay round are actually plurilateral agreements under the Tokyo round, like the anti-dumping agreement, like the substance and countervailing measures agreements. Those were plurilateral agreements to begin with, and they eventually proved their worth and became multilateral. So this is what we want to do. And that should also deal with the speed element of the e-commerce negotiations. If you keep it like-minded, if you keep to the critical mass of those countries who recognize the need for new rules on e-commerce, for better regulation in services, and not just services, hopefully, then we can have a result faster, which will eventually multiply. Yeah. And we still need to look at, and we can do that. There are mechanisms that would allow us to make sure that these plurilateral agreements are under the WTO umbrella. There are ways to make that even easier and better, which I won't go into. It involves Annex 4 of the WTO agreement, if anyone is interested. We're not there yet, but the aim is an incremental multilateralization, if you will, of what the like-minded would like to see put together. On monitoring, as you may have seen, what we feel is fundamentally important is that the WTO continues to be a center where, a forum where every member can peer review and get a very good understanding of what other its trading partners are doing. Transparency has not, the transparency obligations that already exist are not implemented the way they should. And we have already put proposals forward together with the US and together with Japan to deal with this problem. Finally, on dispute settlement. I don't think that maintaining a fully functioning one-tier dispute settlement system is mutually exclusive with trying to preserve the appellate body. And we are looking at interim solutions, as you probably have read in the press, as our commissioner said after the Foreign Affairs Council. But the key is in the adjective, interim. We know that the appellate body will basically cease functioning at the end of the year, with 2 appellate body members will retire. What we want is to ensure that we have a functioning dispute settlement system in place while we solve the appellate body issue for the long term. So our focus continues to be the resolution of the crisis. Our focus continues to be to get to a point where new appellate body members will be appointed under the current rules. In the meantime, given that we feel that dispute settlement on the basis of rules is the best way to deal with trade conflict, we are exploring what we can do to make sure that the dispute settlement function of the WTO continues while we sort out the appellate body crisis. And how are we doing all this? Well, you may ask. We, as was mentioned, we have the trilateral cooperation with the US and Japan. Our ministers just had a meeting in Paris last month. We have also the working group with China, and it is surprise, it will come as no surprise to anyone that our view is that China will have to be a fundamental part of this WTO reform, maybe in ways that it won't particularly like, but we cannot ignore the reality that China is now a major player. We have what we call the Ottawa Group, which is a Canadian initiative bringing together the like-minded, and there we cooperate very well, especially on issues of the effectiveness of the monitoring function. We have the negotiations, the multilateral negotiations on fisheries, which will be a very good example of what the WTO can do in terms of promoting the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are working ceaselessly to try and bring the WTO and the multilateral trading system where it belongs, definitely back for the brink, but not just back for the brink, back to the center of global trade. And I'll stop here and take your questions.
Thank you very much. Maito, I just want to ask you if I understood you correctly. So a kind of two-track approach at the moment, given the crisis in the appellate body, try and solve that later on, but for the moment preserve the dispute settlement system through possibly arbitration as well.
We're trying now to solve it.
Yeah.
But we recognize that we may not be possible before December.
Right.
So we're trying to to explore what other solutions there are to keep, because the problem, and I think this is what you were alluding to, the problem is that without an appellate body, there is a risk that the panel stage won't even work. Because you have a panel report, and then under the current rules, if that panel report is appealed, it cannot be adopted. So it doesn't become binding. So if there's no appellate body to appeal to, then it just falls into the void, and you no longer have binding dispute settlement. Yeah, so that's the problem. That's where the one-tier system may fail, unless we have something to either, as you say, we can have a no appeal pact, but I think the temptation to appeal into the void of a particularly bad panel report may prove too high. Or you have a pre-arranged, a pre-agreed alternative that you can then use.
Okay. As an ad hoc emergency measure. Okay, thank you very much. I have other questions, but I'll leave them for later. So Hiro-san, please. Yes, please.
So, good afternoon. My name is Hiro Inoue. I'm the head of JETRO Brussels office here in Brussels. And I'd like to briefly explain about the Japanese industry's perspective on the importance of the WTO and its reform. And it's not made in Japan, probably.
Okay. So I think again, Hiro-san, if you just take this, yeah.
Thank you very much.
It's a battery.
It's a battery.
No,
Okay.
Batteries are not made in Japan.
Yes. So, yes, I will skip those memos, the overview of JETRO. Yes, I will skip it. But so far, JETRO has assisted more than 600 European companies in entering into the Japanese market. So we are not only supporting Japanese companies to export from Japan to the European Union, but also the European companies too. So that's the reason why I am invited today to talk about the WTO and its importance. And as you can see, these numbers, even before the entry into force of the EU-Japan EPA, the Japanese industries have fostered mutual beneficial relationships with the European Union. And especially the Japanese FDI has been growing constantly. And even before the entry into force of the EU-Japan EPA, around 6,000 Japanese companies are now employing approximately 0.5 million people here in Europe and 45 billion euros procuring. So it's a very, very win-win situation. And probably thanks to the EU-Japan EPA, the situation will be increased, enhanced better. And please look at these win-win business cooperation. And the strategic objective of the Japanese industries to have this kind of strategic cooperation with European industries to have more creativity or innovation or the productivity in the global competitive market. So we need more trades, we need more investments, and we need more this kind of win-win cooperation with the European Union's industries. And the same things could be said to the European industries too. As you know, even before the entry into force of the EU-Japan EPA, the European Union is the largest investor in Japan, exceeding North America or China. So the situation will be better after the EU-Japan EPA. And also, we have a very good relationship in trades in services. And you can see the EU has a trade surplus in trade in services. It's mainly from the financial service or telecommunication services. And you know very well about these sectors are very data-rich sectors. So we need to enhance further the business environment in the data-driven economy. And there is another reason why the Japanese industries or Japan has to move forward to reform the WTO through the collaboration between industries, universities, and central and local governments. Japan is now aiming to create Society 5.0, and where we can solve social challenges, including rapidly aging society, through making full use of the cutting-edge technologies such as artificial intelligence or IoT or robotics and so forth. And one of the core concepts of Society 5.0 is open innovation. And we understand that we cannot realize necessary technological breakthroughs by ourselves alone. So we need more international cooperation to realize this kind of Society 5.0. So through this kind of perspective, yes, we believe that a rule-based trading order to facilitate more trade, more investments, and more win-win business partnerships a truly important platform for Japan and its industries towards the future. And you can see all these slides on the recent development on the international discussion towards the WTO reform. And this is the slide on the B20 Leaders Summit in March. And Japanese industries are fully support of these 4 pillars of the WTO reform. You can find 7 improve this dispute settlement function and improve its rulemaking function, improve its monitoring function, and finally institutionalize multi-stakeholder consultation mechanisms. And yes, Japanese industries also fully support of the encouraging government's initiatives. First, I would like to draw your attention to the joint statement by the leaders of the European Union and Japan in April. And there, they agreed to strengthen the rule-based multilateral trading system with the WTO as its core. And also, as mentioned by Myoto-san already, the Trilateral initiative of the European Union, the United States, and Japan has been developing these 3 pillars for the very important issues to realize the level playing field issues in this global market. And also, the Trilateral initiative reiterates the importance of these 4 pillars of reforming of the WTO. And as for the e-commerce, as Ambassador Kodama already mentioned, Prime Minister mentioned about the data free flow with trust concept, and also he would like to give a political impetus to the WTO negotiation on e-commerce rules towards the future. So the Japanese industries are very much looking forward to have a progressive discussion towards the G20 Osaka summit at the end of this month in Osaka, Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hiro-san. So we've heard from the academic, the practitioner, and the business as well. So three distinct points of view, but coming together to saying there is need for reform and review of certain paramount features of the WTO. I'm happy to take questions from all of you. I'd ask you to identify yourself, and if you could also just keep your remarks and your questions just brief and to the point, so I can come back to the panel for their responses. Please. Happy to give you the floor. Do we have a roving microphone to give to? You can take mine if you like. The gentle Carol, thanks. Thank you. Please.
Good afternoon. I'm Guillaume van der Loo, a researcher here at CEPS. I have just a specific question for mainly the first two speakers, linking the process on WTO reform and the Japan context. So in December, the EU proposed this communication to the General Council on the reform of the appellate body. And I was surprised to see it's sponsored by several like-minded and also non-like-minded countries, but not Japan. However, Japan co-sponsored another proposal for reform with regard to transparency and notification. I think this was mainly in the Trilateral context. So I was a bit surprised to see that Japan was not co-sponsoring this specific proposal, and this is because Japan has another view on this, or are there other reasons?
Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some more questions from the floor. Anyone want to come in at this point? Okay, not really. So, Yuka-san, do you want to kick off?
You know, I'm not from the Japanese government, and my view is obviously different from the Japanese government's viewpoint. I have to make it clear first. And I personally think a bit disappointing that the Japan has not joined the EU or other countries in making some proposals. And however, I had the impression that the Japanese government, I'm sorry, maybe I may be wrong, this is just my impression, but I had the impression that the Japanese government share the same interest as the EU or other countries, meaning that for Japan as a whole, the appellate body is very important, and it's very important for us that the appellate body keeps working, and it's important to have 7 members in the appellate body, and it's important to have a consistent jurisprudence made by the appellate body. However, I have to say, to be honest, the Japanese government changed its view, perhaps, after the appellate body's decision in Korea's case, and perhaps the Japanese government now has a bit cautious view on the appellate body, and the government is now a bit cautious about the so-called lawmaking by the appellate body, and they're saying something negative about consistent jurisprudence by the appellate body. And one of Japan's proposal was about non-binding nature of appellate body's decision and so on. And in a very recent DSB meeting, the Japanese government said that, indicated that the appellate body should not reverse panel's decision if panels made sound judgment as to facts, scientific facts, which I personally don't share, honestly. And that view, I have to say, partly reflects the Japanese people's sentiment against the appellate body. Japanese people wasn't so interested in the appellate body. They were not interested in the WTO-DS, but after the specific decision in Korea's case, there was sort of skepticism in the population against not just the appellate body, but the whole WTO dispute settlement system.
And perhaps that may, I don't know, influence the government's view. And in some points, the Japanese government sort of supports the US view on the appellate body. So again, I'm just speaking from my own personal perspective. I may be wrong about what Japanese government really thinks, but in any way, they may have a bit different view from the other WTO members on the issue of the appellate body.
Mute. I definitely don't represent the Japanese government. So
No, but your response to this stance, were you surprised?
The question is, why did the Japanese not correspond?
No, my question would be, were you surprised that, given the like-minded nature of your relationship and, stressing this all the time, how much you see things in the same way, were you surprised by this?
We were disappointed.
So Yuka and Mato are both disappointed. Could I just ask you, Professor Yuka, so if this is going to be, if the appellate bodies and the demands for non-legally binding, legally binding WTO rulings were supposed to be the centerpiece of this rules-based order. So what we're really doing, if I may ask, is gradually just, doing with the karate system, breaking down that edifice that we created about rules-based order, right? Well, when we talk about effects of the appellate body decisions, we have to distinguish the impact of the decisions on specific cases and the impact of the appellate body decisions in future cases. And the appellate body has never said their decisions are binding in future cases. Precedent is not binding. Precedent is just maybe authoritative in real life, but it's not binding, and the appellate body has never said binding. I think I'm an academic, and I can say freely, it's only the U.S. which is saying precedent, it's only the U.S. which is saying the appellate body is saying precedent is binding, but it's not true. I don't know if the U.S. is intentionally misrepresenting what the appellate body said, or genuinely wrong about what the appellate body said. But anyway, the point is the precedent is very important, and security and predictability is a key in the world trading system. And the appellate body recognizes that, but the appellate body has never said its precedent is binding.
We're talking about two different types of binding. One is I think what Yuka was referring to was about whether a decision of the appellate body is binding on panels, so they have to follow the same reasoning, that is precedent, and the appellate body said that there is no precedent, and no one says that there is precedent in the domestic legal order sense of court decision. But the appellate body has said that panels should follow the appellate body reasoning unless there are cogent reasons not to do so, which is not the same as precedent, but I think that's one type of binding that we're thinking of. The second type of binding is whether the member in question who has been condemned by the appellate body is bound to implement the decision of the dispute settlement body. So that I don't think anyone is actually challenging. But of course, again, the enforcement in WTO is novel in the sense that you don't have another multilateral organization that actually provides for binding enforcement, but no one can force anyone to change their laws. What the WTO says is, the dispute settlement part says, you have a choice now. What you have done is against the rules. Yeah? So you either change your rules or you pay compensation. But the choice remains with the sovereign WTO member. No one can force you to change your laws. And what we have seen in decades of jurisprudence is that usually governments obey and enforce if that's what they really wanted to do in the first place, but they were constrained by domestic pressure. Otherwise, they don't change their laws, and they say, fine, we'll compensate, as we have done on a number of occasions, as I'm sure Japan has done on others. So we talk about enforceability, we talk about binding enforcement, but it's again, it's not the straitjacket or the absolute mechanism that domestic courts are. And I think this is where the US narrative doesn't make much sense, because no one is making them do anything or change their laws. It's a choice that that we all make every time the appellate body or a panel finds that we have breached the rules that we have all agreed on.
Right. But I think, thank you both of you very much for your clarification. Hiro-san, does all of this matter to business? All these intricacies?
Yes, from even the Japanese industry's perspective, the appellate body is a very, very important structure. So it is a kind of a crown jewel of the WTO system. So we Japanese industries think that it would be very, very important to defend and, if necessary, reform towards the future.
Thank you very much. Happy to take more questions, so please. Yeah? Thank you. Thank you very much, Renan.
I'm a professor of WTO law, so my question may be a bit surprising to you. I hear you saying that the WTO should...
It's not on, and I think you need to hold it closer to your mouth.
I hear you saying that the WTO should be back at the center stage, etc. At the same time, we cannot ignore that the United States, in certain ways, is withdrawing from the WTO. And maybe we should also add that China is not exactly adhering to the fundamentals of WTO either. On the other hand, we see an increasing number of ties between the EU and Asian countries. Japan, we're talking about today, but we have Korea, we are close to finalizing with Vietnam, we have Australia, New Zealand coming on. And so at one point I'm asking myself, if we look at sort of a more realistic view of life, WTO minus the United States and minus China, should we not think more about an intermediate solution, which is the EU joining up with the TPP? Would that not be a way forward and a more realistic way forward? And would that not give a better boost to all the things that we try to achieve on electronic commerce, et cetera, than to, you know, continue pursue this chimera of the WTO 20 years, as you kindly reminded us, and on the other hand, this continuing bilateral discussion, which creates a host of problems, as we've also heard from Mr. van Beurden, for instance, rules of origin, et cetera, et cetera. Should we not simply start talking about something that, where we do seem like-mindedness, which is Europe and Asia, and use the Japan-EU agreement on the one hand, maybe the TPP on the other hand, as a more productive vehicle?
Thank you very much, Professor. Anyone else? Thank you very much indeed. Anyone else want to come in at this point? Yes, Micah, please.
Thank you. First of all, a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in the field, but I would like to join in the out-of-the-box thinking. I've heard the EU ambassador to the WTO say that there's basically a Champions League and a few second-tier states, and then more than 100 states that altogether represent less than 1% of global GDP, right? And what I hear is a lot of trilateral. So that's the three ganging up against or trying to, well, to sort of order China's state capitalism into the current system. And the trilateral is then, of course, the US and Japan and the EU. And I see a lot of benefit in trying to do that because of the sheer power that the three represent in the field of trade. At the same time, I wonder whether we are not losing out on those that very big group of other countries that we could also try and bind more closely to us as a way of influencing China, because I think if more of those countries are on our side and agree with the problems that we see with China's state capitalism, that might be another way to try and push for change. So I wonder what options are considered in that regard. And of course, what comes to my mind, again as a non-expert, agricultural subsidies will be a big issue with them. A good way to create goodwill, to put it very bluntly. And what opportunities might there be for that? Or if not that, what else? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else want to come in at this point? Okay, if not, I'm going to turn to the panel, but I'd like to add to what Professor and Micah have said as well, because it's something that we've been thinking about as well at Friends of Europe. First of all, for the TPP, I think there is an appetite now in Asia. I think, Professor, you're right. Many Asian countries are bringing it up with the European Union, a thing that never happened before. I think global Britain, Britain coming into the picture perhaps changes European Union attitudes towards TPP 11. My second point also, follow up on both of you have said, is that the EU does have some very interesting bilaterals, EPA, but also with Singapore. You have this e-commerce plurilateral. Why can't these bilateral agreements sort of become the regulatory standard, if you like, and be open to countries joining in? So a join-in option, which would then sort of recreate WTO rules, but in a more realistic and probably relevant fashion to the 21st century. So I'd like all three of you to come in that. Perhaps, Merto, you want to start, and then I'll go to Yuka and Hiro-san.
We are not at the realm of out-of-the-box ideas yet.
It's not that broken
It's
yet.
in any event, there's a new commission starting, so you never know what a new president or a new trade commissioner will bring. But at the moment, we still see enormous value in a truly multilateral forum, an organization that the EU joining TPP will not be. And then there are also the questions of whether we like it, the TPP. I mean, there are elements there that that are not the standards that we're negotiating necessarily in our bilaterals. So there's that. But as I said, we're not quite there yet. We still see enormous value in the WTO. On how we're going about it, yes, the Trilateral is one form of cooperation, but it's not the only forum that we're using. We are very active in Geneva. We have President Juncker has announced a new Africa strategy, so our focus is going to have to be there as well. And we see the value and the importance of ensuring big chunks of the globe being involved in eventually in the WTO in a more substantive manner than they're doing now. It's the Champions League and the second and third. I think it was Pascal Lamy who said that rather than our current EU ambassador. No, so on agriculture. Just before Buenos Aires, just before the ministerial conference 2 years ago, we actually made a proposal with Brazil, which was unthinkable at the time, on domestic support. So this is, although you will hear us talk a lot about new issues like strengthening subsidies rules, like forced technology transfer, like e-commerce. We are firmly of the view that everything is on the table. We were the ones who made a proposal on domestic support in Buenos Aires that was not taken up. We're not discounting anything, but we need to also see goodwill, and we need to avoid the trap of a single undertaking, which we have seen doesn't work.
Well, I don't have any answer to the questions and comments that we just received. But sometimes these days I ask myself a philosophical question. What is a WTO? Is a WTO something that keeps making ambitious rules and settle disputes in a binding process? And if any member cannot follow, cannot
obey these processes, cannot follow the processes, maybe that members should leave. Or maybe the WTO may be more flexible, and perhaps one of the most important merits, advantages of the WTO is that there are more than 160, nearly 170 members, including China and the US. So I personally don't support a few members pushing one member to change its policy, or perhaps the flexibility needs to be incorporated in the WTO. And anyway, about rulemaking, there have to be several channels, and we have trilateral process and other FTAs and so on. And perhaps those different channels work together and make new rules. And the WTO is not the only forum. But anyway, okay, yes.
Thank you. So it's not the only forum, many channels, but that also creates a lot of confusion, overlap, and duplication. So I think that's one thing that's why we talk of the multilateral. But you're right, we need to be perhaps more realistic and relevant. So Hiro-san, once again, your point of view on how necessary it is to have rules, and are we becoming too creative here? Are we actually starting from scratch and maybe ruining something that doesn't need to be fixed to that extent?
Yes, in short, I think that most of the Japanese industries support the WTO system and also the reform of it. So we don't have to start from the scratch, because I think most of the Japanese industries and US, EU, or Chinese industries have been benefited from the WTO system. But at the same time, some Japanese big industries are now facing with a very difficult question right now regarding their global supply chain. Do we have to choose the US or China? So it's a very, very difficult question, and that's the question that we would like to avoid towards the future. So we need a kind of a, maintenance of the WTO system towards the future, but we don't have to discard that kind of crown jewel of the WTO, the trade system in this world. That's probably the Japanese industry's view.
Thank you very much. So absolutely, for us in Europe as well, no binary choices. It's Europe first, and I guess it's Japan first as well. Look after our own interests and not choose others' interests. Thank you very much to all three panelists. Please join me in saying thank you to them. Thank you to SEPS. Carol, I'd like to give you the floor. I think Gunnar is here.
Thank you, Shada, for, sorry for my voice is a bit gone, but thank you, Shada, for an interesting panel. I don't fully understand the solution, but I hope we will get there. So the EPA has also a political dimension. I'm very happy, let's say, we have Gunnar here to speak about that dimension, because, of course, we have been speaking mostly about trade, Gunnar, about, first of all, let's say, what is going to be opened up by this new agreement, and then secondly, what is the link with the multilateral trade order? But of course, we know you're representing the External Action Service, which is dealing with the political relationship. So we listen to you. How do you see the political relationship between the EU and Japan, and what has changed with this agreement? So for those who do not know, Gunnar is the managing director in the External Action Service. External Action Service was created about 10 years ago as a separate diplomatic service for the EU. You all know the head of this service is Mogherini, and Gunnar works there to deal with the Asian region. Gunnar, you can stand up as you wish. Yes.
So I'm afraid this is now the downturn of this exciting event where probably you are all trade policy experts, and you wonder why the hell should there be somebody who speaks about foreign security policy questions. I would like to underline that relations with Japan are, of course, much more than only trade investment, even though this is a very important dimension, but we are dealing here with a like-minded partner. And we nowadays have some categories for these like-minded partners. So this is a truly like-minded partner. And it is a comprehensive relationship we have with Japan. It is not only trade investment, it's not only energy and transport, it is not only ocean governance and migration, it is not only cooperation on foreign policy subjects in the neighborhood, it's also cooperation on regional, on global challenges, climate change, for example. So while we negotiated, and the Director General for Trade of the Commission was in the lead on this, on the Economic Partnership Agreement, we negotiated in parallel a strategic partnership agreement. And that's the so-called SPA. And this is the first time ever Japan has entered into such an agreement. It was not easy to negotiate this with the Japanese side, and it was, in fact, not necessarily Japanese enthusiasm which has brought us to negotiate this. It was a requirement from the European Union side. We will not only enter into an FTA, we also want to have clarity about the fundamentals of our relationship, which are democracy, human rights, rule of law, the full implementation of international conventions in many fields, including on non-proliferation. The human rights and the non-proliferation are the essential elements which govern our relations overall with Japan, and a number of other important points. We wanted to have an enabling instrument which allows us to not only significantly increase our foreign and security policy cooperation, but also our cooperation in many sectoral areas, because by definition an EPA, an FTA only covers market access, and this in many fields. And of course these are very concrete concessions which are made to each other, but we also want to effectively work on ocean governance. We also want to effectively work on climate change. We want to even cooperate effectively on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, which is not a market access concession, but is about learning from each other's experiences. So all these things, both the regional and the global foreign security policy issues, the home and justice matters, but also the sectoral cooperation areas you find in that strategic partnership agreement. And with Japan, we hope to have in the not too distant future, at some point, also a framework participation agreement which would allow Japanese military or civilian officers to join one of the 16 missions abroad of the EU, currently 16, with some 6,000 staff involved. Few people know about this, but yes, the EU does project its security interests abroad with such missions, from Operation Sophia, well known in the Mediterranean, to Central African Republic or Mali, to the, for Asians, well known naval operation EUNAVFOR Atalanta in the Indian Ocean, in front of the Horn of Africa, where we have regular Korean support. We have partners in the region, which are Korea, Australia, New Zealand. Australia just seconded an officer to our advisory mission in Baghdad. We hope to do something similar with Japan in future. So that is one of the ambitions, and we probably will benefit from Japanese officers first observing these kind of missions abroad. There's of course a special difficult history for Japan linked to all these questions, and external missions are not an easy to be agreed decision in the Diet. When we had our first EU-Japan joint committee under this agreement in March of this year, this was just before the first joint committee under the Economic Partnership and Agreement. It was a vivid reminder for us, meaning EU institution and the member states together, how many areas we could actually develop for much closer cooperation in a structured way. This was also the central message of our political leaders when they had their summit on the 26th of April. We are like-minded, we are having a close strategic partnership, and there is quite an important number of global issues where the Japanese and the Europeans look eye to eye. When Prime Minister Abe was here, his main interest was, of course, to have that like-mindedness translated into European Union support for key Japanese priorities in the G20 context, which is chaired this year by the Japanese. And President Tusk and Juncker will travel to Osaka later this month. Let me now just single out three of these questions. I already briefly touched on security and defense, with non-proliferation concerns being at the top of our concerns as well as at the top of the Japanese concerns. You know about the distinct political choice made not to possess nuclear weapons by Japan, and therefore the situation of the Korean Peninsula is a key security concern for Japan. It is affected not only by long-range missiles but also by mid-range missiles. The EU and the Japanese are fully agreeing on the complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization by North Korea. If I understand correctly, after the failure of the Hanoi summit, Japanese Prime Minister has announced publicly that he would like to go to Pyongyang without any precondition to negotiate an understanding with North Korea. That is, of course, a courageous step forward, which has not yet been responded to by the leadership of North Korea. Last weekend, in fact, Federica Mogherini was in the Shangri-La dialogue discussing how to overcome the current stalemate on the Korean Peninsula together with the defense ministers of Japan and of Korea at a joint panel. In the short term, our joint emphasis is on enforcement of UN sanctions. Enforcement in many ways, and here Japan and EU work closely together in ensuring that the UN Security Council resolutions would not be circumvented. We work also with the Japanese in policy dialogue and concrete cooperation on some of the less looked after cases of security concern. Philippines, for example, where there is a major terrorism threat and the newly found autonomous regime for parts of Mindanao needs to be implemented now. Myanmar, the difficult situation with the Rohingya and their expulsion to a large degree from Myanmar to Bangladesh, which has all the ingredients for a regional crisis if this is not properly solved soon. But we also work together on the Afghan peace talks and on the reconstruction once there would be a peace agreement found in the inter-Afghan talks between the two sides. For the last 19 years, the EU and Japan have belonged to the most important providers of financial assistance, keeping afloat this country. More than 60% of the civilian expenditure in Afghanistan is paid for by international donors. More than 95% of the military expenditure is paid for by international support. We appreciate Japan's support in upholding the Iran JCPOA. Japan doesn't like to be too explicit about certain things it does when it feels there could be some kind of pushback from some of its closest partners. And this refers also to the Iran JCPOA deal. But both Japan and us regard this as essential in keeping peace in the Middle East. Second question I wish to single out is the emerging field of digital policy and cybersecurity. It's becoming increasingly important both in our bilateral relations, and the Japanese G20 presidency pays particular attention to it, calls it also the Osaka track, which is on the one side the need to have a more enabling environment for the digital economy, and on the other hand, to have as much as possible so-called data free flow with trust among countries with similar security requirements for that digital side of the economy. We have in Europe set standards on the protection of private data. These standards have become de facto global standards, and Japan was one of the first countries which has entered into a so-called mutual adequacy decision on both sides, that we consider our respective fields of data protection as equivalent. This allows then that the data can indeed flow freely on the basis of the right protection of private data. But there is the additional question of cybersecurity, which is becoming more and more prominent. And nowhere has this become more evident than in the discussion of the 5G networks, where Japan has clearly chosen its camp. We want to avoid a global divide. We wish to preserve the freedom of the internet. We don't want to have totally separated internets, but we must make sure that there is no use of surveillance technologies by authoritarian regimes by using that freedom of the internet. So the EU and Japan could not be closer on these questions. There will be next week an EU-Japan cyber dialogue in Osaka, and Japan and the EU cooperate closely also in the relevant UN groups and on WTO digital, rather e-commerce negotiations. The EU has recently developed a number of proposals on how to tackle the intricate questions on 5G networks by proposing that we would have a joint security assessment on the key risks between member states, and secondly, then the application of common risk assessment benchmarks. This is something which has been proposed by the Commission, was endorsed a few days earlier as the principled approach by the heads of state and government, is however something done in an area which is national by definition, because it is not only about the licensing of companies in the 5G context, it is also about the definition of what constitutes national security. There is no notion of national EU security. There is national security. This doesn't make the EU always an easy partner for our partners on these kind of issues, but the increased attention not only to the protection of personal data, but also to the security of the use of data matches the Japanese wish to work for a data-free flow with trust, which is something which the Japanese side will certainly push further in the G20 context. Third question I wish to single out is connectivity and the nexus of it to high-tech research. Some of you may have realized that the EU has adopted its own connectivity strategy, even though everybody believes that China has invented connectivity through the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, we are building connectivity for decades to connect our economies, our transport systems, our energy systems, communication systems across border with a strong human connection basis. That's the essence of the success of the single market, that these borders were overcome with an ever closer connectivity, which has then led to an extension of this through trans-European networks into our neighborhood. We have to give credit to China that it has put this high on the agenda of the world, by developing ideas on a global scale and by having a long-term view on this, and by looking at the global value chains, necessity to be interconnected, not just only transport networks or only energy networks or only digital networks, but also the interconnections between them. So we have seen this connectivity strategy as a perhaps late, but nevertheless timely contribution of Europe with the key principles which have led to the success in the internal market, the principles of sustainability, the social sustainability, the environmental sustainability, the economic viability of projects to be looked at first before engaging into new projects, and then the long-term sustainability in terms of the fiscal capabilities of a country. And that all this needs to be done according to international norms and standards in a level playing field with transparency. These are simple, clear principles, but not always observed by everyone. We are proud and happy that it was possible to convince our partners. And here I'm not talking only about Japan or Korea or Australia, but also India and also China, that these are the right principles to build upon. The Japanese, for a longer time, have pursued their own connectivity policy, calling it the quality infrastructure development, and they have quite an advanced program with support from the state budget, but mainly with significant mobilization of private investment over the last few years. So Japan puts this in the concept also of its free and open Indo-Pacific, similarly to the US. China has its Belt and Road Initiative with the famous success of the Belt and Road Initiative Forum, and many member states now having also memoranda of understanding with China on this. India is also becoming an increasingly important player. So Europe has found its own narrative, and we will work very closely together with the Japanese in implementing principles which are common to both sides. And in the G20 context, Japan is driving strongly the quality infrastructure approach. It is, I would say, almost a cultural revolution for our development colleagues to think much more in terms of private investment facilitation through the use of development assistance means, which in future will include guarantees for investments, for investment financing mobilization, something which the Japanese know already for quite some time, and which our Chinese partners don't have to think so much about, because they can ask the state-owned banks to support the state-owned companies to build the infrastructure. It is also a challenge for our sectoral colleagues to think intersectoral and to think in terms of not only our internal market legislation or international agreements, but to think also in terms of regional networks, regional corridors, and what is in the EU's interest. Again, compliments to China, which has thought much more about this much earlier. Let me inform you in this context that we are working with China on the study of the best options for improved land railway connections between China and the EU, which may be also of interest to or have an impact on Japan. This will be done now in a study by the World Bank. It has so far animated mainly think tankers, this question. It is now seriously researched, whether it's the northern, the central, or the southern route, and then it's a question of convincing the investors. We will work with Japan on new technologies, such as fuel cell vehicles. We will work with Japan also on development assistance in third countries, Southeast Asia, in particular Pacific, Africa. To sum up, all these examples illustrate, yes, economy matters, but political overall direction is important, and we need to work together across different sectors. We can't do just traditional policies of transport or just traditional policy of trade. Things are very much closely linked and will be ever more linked in future. We are closely aligned with the EU and Japan in our international interests, and we are both deeply convinced that we have to work for global cooperation and a fair interest balance as opposed to confrontation. This brings us also together, and as the last panel concluded, that people want to avoid binary choices. Certainly the EU has no interest in make a pro-US or pro-China choice. I wouldn't say, like Shada said, Europe first, but definitely we have to find European answers to the challenges, and the more and the closer we can work with like-minded, the better for both of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunnar, for a fascinating speech. I mean, I think we made the tour very well from the more specific trade-related issues. We went quite into detail to then the multilateral issues and now to the political issues. I think you opened the eyes for the importance of this relationship and what many of these things of which we don't read, as you were saying, often, but how important they are to keep overall political stability. I look around, as there were to be one quick question, otherwise we close it here. I think, let's say, it was a perfect end of this day. We had a fairly intense 2 sessions, an opening by the ambassador, and then by another person from the European Commission, from the cabinet of Juncker. And then we discussed these 2 things, but I think that was an interesting end.
And the weather is very good outside.
You hear it to my voice, apparently. It's not that good. So if I can thank you all, and if I can thank also the mission of Japan and their delegates which are here for their contribution. Also, thanks to those who came from far, let's say, to enrich our debate. That was very useful, that we are not only speaking in the Brussels bubble. I think those who are here today will have seen it was not only a Brussels bubble. We had a good public, which came a bit from all over Europe and some from Japan. So that was very interesting to hear the strong support also for the multilateral system, for example, in Japan, and the problems you experienced from that angle. And I hope, let's say, we can continue this dialogues as we have. And let me thank also Waynian for the organization, and also Guillaume for his support, my colleague, and others in the House who have made this possible. So with this, thank you very much, and we'll certainly stay in touch. And as I said in the beginning, we'll have a short summary, which should be available in the coming days. A short one, not a very long one. Thank you very much.